I stood frozen in the middle of my wedding reception, red wine dripping down the ivory silk of my dress like blood, while my sister Vanessa smirked at the gathered crowd. "Oops," she said loud enough for everyone to hear. "Guess that cheap wedding gown wasn't worth protecting anyway." Laughter rippled through the room. Nervous. Cruel. I watched my sister bask in the attention, her eyes glittering with triumph, the golden child finally putting me in my place. But then something shifted. Vanessa's father-in-law, Gerald Whitman, a distinguished man I'd only met at her wedding, approached with an expression that made the air feel heavy. He leaned close to Vanessa and whispered something in her ear. 3 seconds. That's all it took for her smile to die. Her face drained of color. Her hands began to tremble. She stumbled backward, gripping the table for support, staring at me like she'd just seen a ghost. "Natalie, Her voice cracked. "I didn't know. Please, you have to—" I reached into my bouquet, pulled out a single piece of paper, and handed it to her. Vanessa's eyes went wide as she read. Then wider. Then she collapsed, fainting into her husband's arms as gasps erupted around us. You see, everyone assumed my dress was cheap department store fabric. They had no idea it was a lost masterpiece worth over $1 million. They didn't know it held secrets that had been buried for 50 years. And they certainly didn't know that my Aunt May, the woman who raised me, had spent her final days sewing evidence of a crime into every stitch. My sister thought she was humiliating me. She had no idea she'd just activated a trap 5 decades in the making. And before this is over, she'll learn that some truths can't stay buried forever, especially when they're stitched in silver thread. My name is Natalie Gordon. I'm 39 years old, and until 6 months ago I worked as a reference librarian at the Brookfield Public Library in Massachusetts. Most people who know me would describe me as quiet, dependable, forgettable, the kind of woman who fades into the background of family photos. I spent most of my adult life taking care of other people. My mother when she was sick, my younger sister when she needed money, my Aunt May in her final years. I never expected to be the center of attention at my own wedding. I certainly never expected it to become the beginning of something that would change everything I thought I knew about my family. The ceremony itself had been small and sweet. Daniel, my husband of exactly 2 hours, had chosen a beautiful old church in the heart of New England, all white clapboard and stained glass windows that caught the autumn light just right. 80 guests filled the pews, mostly his family and our mutual friends, with a small scattering of relatives from my side. My sister Vanessa had flown in from New York with her husband Trevor, making a grand entrance the night before at the rehearsal dinner, dressed like she was attending the Met Gala instead of a modest family wedding. She'd kissed my cheek and told me how adorable everything was in that tone she uses when she really means the opposite. The reception was being held in the church's adjacent hall, a charming space with exposed wooden beams and round tables covered in simple white linens. I'd planned everything carefully and modestly. We weren't wealthy people, Daniel and I. He was a high school history teacher, and my library salary had never been extravagant. But it was ours, and it was genuine, and standing in the middle of that room in the dress Aunt May had left me, I felt more beautiful than I ever had in my life. The dress. God, the dress. Everyone assumed I'd bought it at a department store or perhaps borrowed it from a friend. It was ivory silk with delicate pearl buttons down the back and lace sleeves that ended just past my wrists. Simple at first glance. Elegant in an understated way that matched the whole tone of our wedding. What they didn't know, what almost no one knew, was that this dress had a history that stretched back more than 50 years, and that my Aunt May had guarded it with her life. May had been a seamstress, one of the most talented in New England, though she'd worked from a tiny shop that most people walked past without noticing. In her final weeks dying slowly in the hospice bed, I'd sat beside every evening after work. She'd gripped my hand with surprising strength and whispered, "Wear the dress from the trunk, Natalie. When the time comes, wear it and don't be afraid. This dress reveals truth, not just beauty." I'd thought she was being poetic in that way dying people sometimes are offering me something meaningful to remember her by. I had no idea she was giving me a weapon. The toast was supposed to be the highlight of the evening. Daniel's best man had just finished a funny, heartfelt speech that had everyone laughing and wiping their eyes. I was standing near the head table, Daniel's arm around my waist, when I saw Vanessa making her way toward us through the crowd. She was holding a glass of red wine, a deep, rich burgundy that caught the light. She was smiling, but it was the smile I'd learned to recognize over 33 years of sisterhood, the one that meant she was about to do something that would hurt me while looking like an accident. She'd been drinking steadily since the ceremony ended, growing louder and more animated with each glass. I'd watched her laughing too hard at other people's jokes, touching Trevor's arm possessively whenever another woman came near, checking her phone constantly, even though she'd promised to be fully present for my big day. Now she was weaving slightly as she approached, and I felt Daniel tense beside me. "A toast," Vanessa announced, her voice carrying across the room in that way she'd perfected as an influencer, always performing for an audience. "To my big sister Natalie. So practical, so sensible, so—" She paused, and in that pause I saw something flicker in her eyes, something dark and deliberate. Then she stumbled forward, the movement so theatrical it would have been laughable if it weren't so calculated, and the entire glass of wine cascaded down the front of my dress. The room went silent. That awful, breathless silence that happens when everyone knows they've just witnessed something terrible, but they're not sure if they're allowed to react yet. "Oops," Vanessa said, her voice dripping with false concern. "Guess that cheap dress wasn't worth protecting anyway." Nervous laughter rippled through the crowd. Some people looked away embarrassed. Others stared, waiting to see what I would do. I felt Daniel's arm tighten around me, felt him start to step forward, but I touched his hand gently, stopping him. I stood perfectly still and watched the wine soak into the silk. The stains spread like blood across the ivory fabric, seeping into the intricate stitching that May had worked on with her arthritic hands. In the mirror on the far wall, I caught my own reflection, wine-stained, humiliated, the center of attention in the worst possible way. But I didn't cry. I didn't shout. Instead, I heard May's voice again, as clearly as if she were standing beside me. "When the wine spills, the truth will follow." That's when Gerald Whitman moved. I'd only met Gerald twice before, once at Vanessa's wedding to his son Trevor 3 years ago, and once at a stiff family dinner last Christmas. He was 70 years old, distinguished-looking, with silver hair, and the bearing of someone who'd spent his life in museums and galleries. Trevor had mentioned his father had been a curator, something to do with textiles and historical artifacts, but I'd never paid much attention. Now, watching him cross the room toward us, I saw something in his expression that made my skin prickle, recognition and alarm. He wasn't looking at me. He was staring at my dress, his face going pale beneath his tan. His eyes traced the neckline, the sleeves, the way the fabric draped, and I saw his lips move silently as if he were counting or calculating something. Then his gaze snapped to my face, and for just a moment I saw something that looked like respect mixed with fear. Gerald walked directly to Vanessa, who was still smirking at me, waiting for my reaction. He leaned close to her ear and whispered something I couldn't hear, but I watched my sister's face, and I saw the exact moment the words registered. Her smile froze. Then it cracked. Then it disappeared, completely replaced by an expression of pure horror. The color drained from her cheeks. Her hands, which had been casually holding the empty wine glass, began to tremble so violently I heard the glass rattle. "No," she whispered so quietly I almost missed it. "That's not, it can't be." She turned to look at me, really look at me, and her eyes were wide with something that looked like genuine fear. "Natalie, I didn't know. I swear to God I didn't know. Please, you have to believe me." I reached into my bouquet, which I'd set on the table beside me. Tucked among the roses and baby's breath was a folded piece of paper sealed in plastic to protect it. I'd put it there that morning, following the instructions May had left in her will. Instructions I hadn't understood until 2 weeks ago, when I'd finally opened all the documentation she'd left in that old trunk along with the dress. I pulled out the document and handed it to Vanessa. My hand was steady. My voice was calm. "I think you need to read this." Vanessa's hands shook as she unfolded the paper. I watched her eyes scan the first few lines, then the next. Then she made a sound like all the air had been punched out of her lungs. The paper slipped from her fingers. She stumbled backward, reaching for the table to steady herself, but her legs wouldn't hold her. Trevor caught her just before she hit the floor, her body going limp in his arms as she fainted dead away. The room erupted in chaos, people rushing forward, someone calling for water, Daniel asking if we should call an ambulance. But I stood in the center of it all, wine-stained and calm, watching my sister's unconscious face, and thinking about everything May had told me in those final days. About secrets sewn into silk. About evidence that had waited 50 years to surface. About the difference between a cheap dress and a masterpiece worth more than most people earned in a lifetime. Why would a single piece of paper cause Vanessa to collapse in the middle of the reception? And what did Gerald whisper that made her realize she'd just made a terrible mistake? The paramedics arrived within 15 minutes, though Vanessa had already regained consciousness by then. She sat slumped in a chair, Trevor hovering anxiously beside her, refusing to meet anyone's eyes. The document I'd handed her lay on the floor where it had fallen, and I watched 3 different guests glance at it curiously before Trevor snatched it up and shoved it into his jacket pocket. The reception had devolved into clusters of whispering guests, some trying to maintain the celebration, while others frankly stared at the drama unfolding before them. My closest friend Sarah, we'd known each other since college, found me standing near the window still in my wine-stained dress. Daniel had gone to speak with the paramedics, and I was grateful for a moment alone with someone I trusted completely. Sarah touched my arm gently, her eyes full of concern mixed with intense curiosity. "Nat," she said quietly, "what the hell just happened? That paper you gave Vanessa and Gerald's reaction, this isn't just about spilled wine, is it?" I looked down at my dress, at the dark burgundy stain spreading across the ivory silk like a wound. Around us, I could hear fragments of conversation, speculation about family drama and sibling rivalry. Let them think what they wanted. They had no idea what they were really looking at. "This dress," I said, my voice low enough that only Sarah could hear, "isn't what everyone thinks it is. It's called Rhapsody 12. It was designed in 1971 by someone named L. Whitman as part of a collection of 12 dresses. Art historians thought all of them were destroyed in a warehouse fire decades ago." Sarah's eyes widened. "Destroyed? But you're wearing it." "Aunt May had it. She kept it locked in a trunk in her attic for over 50 years. I didn't even know it existed until I read her will." I touched the lace at my sleeve, feeling the intricate needlework beneath my fingers. "It's worth over $1 million, Sarah. Maybe more. But the value isn't really about money. This dress was created during a massive scandal involving the Whitman Foundation, that's Gerald and Trevor's family foundation. $3 million in charitable donations just disappeared in 1971, and the case was never solved. Art historians call pieces like this witness pieces, because they were made during the height of the investigation when everyone involved was under scrutiny." "Jesus," Sarah breathed. "And Vanessa just dumped wine all over it." "Deliberately," I said. "In front of 80 witnesses." Sarah was quiet for a moment, processing. Then she asked the question I'd been waiting for. "What was on that paper?" "A notarized acknowledgement of intentional damage to insured property. When Vanessa took it from me, and especially after Gerald warned her what she'd done, she basically signed a confession. 2 weeks ago, I set up a specialized insurance policy through a firm called Whitmore and Pike Legal Services. May left instructions in her will, very specific instructions. If anyone deliberately damaged this dress, I was supposed to contact them immediately. The policy has a clause that triggers a full forensic investigation whenever intentional damage occurs. Documentation of all witnesses. Potential criminal charges for destruction of historically significant property." "You set a trap," Sarah said, and there was something like awe in her voice. "May set the trap," I corrected. "I just followed her instructions. She wrote me a letter, Sarah. In her final days, when she could barely hold a pen, she wrote that this dress holds more than beauty, it holds evidence. She said when the wine spills, the truth will follow. I didn't understand what she meant until I started researching the Rhapsody collection and found out about the Whitman Foundation scandal. Before Sarah could respond, I saw Gerald moving purposefully through the crowd toward us. His face was ashen, and he kept glancing at my dress with an expression that went far beyond mere scholarly interest. This was personal fear, the kind that comes from knowing something terrible is about to be revealed. "Mrs. Chen," he said to Sarah, his voice tight. "Would you excuse us? I need to speak with Natalie privately." Sarah looked at me questioningly, and I nodded. She squeezed my hand once before stepping away, though I noticed she didn't go far. Gerald waited until the nearest guests had moved out of earshot, then gestured toward a small side room off the main hall where the church stored folding chairs and supplies. "Please," he said, "this is important." I followed him into the cramped space, and he closed the door behind us. In the dim light filtering through a high window, I could see his hands were shaking. He stared at my dress for a long moment before finally meeting my eyes. "Where did May get this dress?" His voice was rough, almost desperate. "Do you know what it is? Do you understand what you're wearing?" "Rhapsody 12?" I said calmly. "Designed by L. Whitman in 1971. Part of a collection commissioned by the Whitman Foundation before the embezzlement scandal. I've done my research, Gerald." He closed his eyes, and I saw him take several deep breaths, as if steadying himself. "I worked as a curator for textile exhibitions at the New England Museum in the 70s and 80s. I know the Rhapsody collection's history intimately. Every piece was supposed to have been destroyed. The foundation, my family's foundation, paid a significant sum to ensure those dresses never surfaced. They were considered too dangerous, too connected to the investigation." "Dangerous how?" Gerald looked at the dress again, and I saw genuine fear in his eyes. "Because the designer didn't just create beautiful clothing. She encoded information into the stitching patterns, account numbers, dates, transfer amounts. She was documenting evidence of the theft, and everyone involved knew it. When she died suddenly in 1971, a car accident, they said the family made sure the dresses disappeared. But May saved this one." "Yes." He ran a hand through his silver hair. "If this truly is Rhapsody 12, then someone at this wedding has everything to lose and they don't even know it yet." "Who?" I asked, but I thought I already knew the answer. Gerald stared at the wine-stained dress and whispered, "I need to tell you something about your aunt, and about why this dress should have stayed hidden forever." Gerald moved closer to the window, where better light streamed in, and gestured for me to turn slightly so he could examine the dress more carefully. His hands hovered near the fabric but didn't touch, as if he were afraid physical contact might somehow activate something dangerous. I watched his eyes trace the lace patterns on the sleeves, following the delicate lines of stitching that ran along the bodice, studying the hem where the wine had soaked deepest into the silk. "I was 24 years old in 1971. He began, his voice taking on the measured tone of someone recounting a story he'd kept locked away for decades. "Fresh out of graduate school with a degree in art history, specializing in textile preservation. I took a position as a junior curator at the New England Museum of Textile Arts, thrilled to be working with historical garments and contemporary textile artists. That's when the Whitman Foundation commissioned the Rhapsody collection." He paused, his finger tracing an invisible line along the dress's neckline without making contact. "The foundation was run by my family. My father, Richard Whitman, was the chairman, and my mother had just passed away the year before. The foundation was her legacy, her passion project. Educational scholarships, community programs, support for local artists. It had an endowment of nearly $5 million built over decades through careful donations and conservative investments." I stood very still, letting him tell the story at his own pace. Outside the small room, I could hear the muted sounds of the reception continuing, though the festive energy had clearly dissipated. Someone was playing soft music, probably trying to salvage what remained of the celebration. In early 1971, a designer who signed her work as L. Whitman, no relation to our family, or so we thought at the time, approached the foundation with a proposal. She wanted to create a collection of 12 gowns for a major charity gala we were planning. each one a wearable work of art that would be auctioned off to raise additional funds. My father agreed, commissioned the work, and advanced her a significant sum for materials and labor. Gerald's jaw tightened. By March of that year, the foundation's accountants discovered that $3 million had vanished from our accounts. Transfer records, grant approvals, check authorizations, all of it looked legitimate on the surface, but the money was gone, disappeared into offshore accounts that couldn't be traced. And the designer? I asked quietly. L. Whitman delivered all 12 dresses on schedule. They were extraordinary museum-quality work. The gala went ahead as planned in April 1971. A woman named Margaret Lane Whitman, my father's first wife, actually my mother wore Rhapsody 12 that night. It was the last time anyone saw her alive. His voice caught slightly. 3 days later, her car went off a cliff road. The police ruled it an accident, but there were always questions. And then the designer herself vanished. No one could locate her, no one could interview her about the foundation's missing money. It was as if she'd never existed. Gerald finally reached out and touched the hem of my dress, his fingers finding a section where the stitching created an intricate geometric pattern. The whispers started almost immediately. People said the designer had sewn evidence into the dresses that she'd used silver thread to encode financial information in the decorative patterns, account numbers disguised as floral motifs, transaction dates hidden in the spacing of pearls. The foundation hired experts to examine the dresses, and they found anomalies, mathematical sequences that didn't match any traditional design pattern. The family panicked. So they destroyed them, I said. They tried. My father paid a substantial sum to acquire all 12 dresses from their various owners and new collectors. He claimed he wanted to donate them to museums, preserve them as examples of important contemporary art. Instead, they were locked in a warehouse, and 2 months later that warehouse burned to the ground, every dress supposedly destroyed. He looked up at me and his eyes were haunted. But your aunt had this one, which means someone saved it from the fire. Someone who knew what it contained and wanted to preserve the evidence. I thought about May, about her small seamstress shop, and her quiet life, about the way she'd kept so many secrets locked behind her gentle smile. You said my aunt was connected to people who knew the truth. She must have been. The designer, the original Margaret Whitman, someone in the investigation, I don't know who, but May was protecting something. Or someone. Gerald's hand trembled as he withdrew it from the dress. For decades, people have been looking for these dresses, offering money, lots of it, to anyone who might have saved one. Not to preserve them, Natalie, but to destroy them. Because if the encoding is real, if those financial records can be extracted from the stitching, then whoever took that $3 million could still be identified and prosecuted. There's no statute of limitations on fraud of that magnitude. A chill ran down my spine despite the warmth of the room. Someone at this wedding, I said slowly, would have known what this dress really was. Yes. Gerald met my eyes and I saw something shift in his expression. The professional distance of a curator fell away, replaced by something far more personal. He reached out and touched my shoulder, the gesture oddly tender. You have your mother's eyes, he said softly. She was a remarkable woman. I froze. I hadn't mentioned my mother's name. Not to Gerald, not in any conversation we'd ever had. My mother had been Sarah Gordon, and she'd died 8 years ago after a long illness. How could Gerald possibly know her name, let alone what she looked like? He must have seen the shock on my face because he quickly added, If my daughter-in-law knew you were wearing this particular dress, she would never have dared touch it. Someone is going to come asking questions, and when they do, please, be careful who you trust. Your daughter-in-law? I managed to say. You mean Vanessa? But she didn't know what this dress was. Her reaction when you told her, not Vanessa? Gerald interrupted, and there was real fear in his voice now. My stepson Trevor's mother. My father's second wife. The woman who took control of the Whitman Foundation after Margaret died and has run it ever since. Her name is Elaine. He pulled a business card from his wallet, one of those plain white cards with nothing but a phone number printed on it. He turned it over and wrote something on the back with a pen he retrieved from his jacket pocket, his handwriting shaky but legible. Then he pressed the card into my palm, closing my fingers around it. "Call me before you talk to anyone else about this dress," he said urgently. "There are things you need to know, things about your aunt, about the foundation, about—" He stopped himself, looking almost physically pained. "I think I might be your father." Before I could process those impossible words, before I could ask any of the 1,000 questions suddenly flooding my mind, Gerald opened the door and slipped back out into the reception hall, leaving me alone with a wine-stained dress worth over $1 million and a business card that had just turned my entire understanding of my own life upside down. I stood in that small storage room for several minutes after Gerald left, staring at the business card in my hand, trying to make sense of the words he'd written on the back. The sounds of the reception filtered through the door, but they felt distant, as if I were underwater. My father. Gerald thought he might be my father, but I'd never had a father, not really. The man my mother married, William Gordon, had left when Vanessa was 5 and I was 11. I barely remembered him, a quiet, restless man who worked construction jobs and drank too much. He'd given us his name and not much else, and when he walked out, my mother never spoke of him again except to say we were better off. I thought about Vanessa at 5 years old, crying for a daddy who wasn't coming back. I thought about myself at 11, suddenly responsible for making sure there was food in the house and that my baby sister got to kindergarten on time. My mother, Sarah, had been a secretary at a real estate office, and her salary barely covered rent and utilities. I'd learned early how to stretch a dollar, how to make mac and cheese interesting 5 different ways, how to be invisible so my mother wouldn't worry about me on top of everything else. Vanessa had been beautiful even as a child, with glossy dark hair and enormous eyes that made strangers stop my mother in the grocery store to comment on how pretty her daughter was. They rarely seemed to notice me standing right there, skinny and serious in hand-me-down clothes, pushing the cart. I'd told myself it didn't matter. Pretty was just genetic luck. It didn't mean anything about who you were inside. But it had mattered to my mother. I could see that now, looking back with adult eyes. Sarah had always lit up when Vanessa entered a room, always made sure Vanessa had nice clothes and opportunities for dance lessons or art classes, even when money was impossibly tight. When I'd gotten a full scholarship to community college and worked 2 jobs to pay for my living expenses, my mother had been proud but unsurprised. "You'll always land on your feet, Natalie," she'd said. "You're a survivor." When Vanessa had wanted to go to a 4-year university to study marketing, my mother had asked me to help with tuition. I'd done it without complaint, taking on extra shifts at the library and the coffee shop, sleeping 4 hours a night for 2 years. After my mother died in 2015, the lawyer reading her will had handed me an envelope with my name on it, along with the small inheritance she'd left me. Vanessa had received 3 times as much, and the note tucked inside her envelope read, "Natalie will always be fine, she's stronger than all of us." I'd sat in that lawyer's office trying not to cry, trying not to feel the sting of being loved less because I'd been competent and dependable. I'd never told Vanessa what that note said. What would have been the point? By then, Vanessa was already building her social media presence, posting carefully curated photos of her beautiful apartment, her trendy clothes, her glamorous life as a lifestyle influencer in New York. She had 180,000 followers who hung on her recommendations for skincare products and vacation destinations. From the outside, she looked wildly successful. I'd been happy for her, or tried to be. She'd always been meant for that kind of life. I thought the spotlight, the attention, the validation of strangers telling her she was special. I hadn't known about the debt, about the boutique she'd opened with investor money 2 years ago, convinced she could translate her online following into retail success, about how spectacularly it had failed, leaving her owing over $200,000 to people who were getting increasingly impatient for repayment. She'd never told me, never asked for help. We'd drifted apart over the years, our phone calls growing shorter and less frequent, our relationship reduced to birthday texts and obligatory holiday visits. When I'd invited her to be in my wedding, I'd hoped it might bring us closer again. Instead, she'd arrived with that brittle brightness I'd learned to recognize, that manic energy that meant she was performing happiness rather than feeling it. I'd watched her drink too much at the rehearsal dinner, watched her compare her designer dress to my simple off-the-rack outfit, watched her post endless Instagram stories about the quaint, New England setting as if she were documenting a trip to a petting zoo rather than her sister's wedding. The wine spill hadn't been impulsive. I understood that now. The way she'd approached with that glass, the theatrical stumble, the cruel comment about my cheap dress, it had all been planned. But planned by whom and why? A soft knock on the door pulled me from my thoughts. I shoved Gerald's business card into the small pocket I'd asked May to sew into the dress's seam, then opened the door to find Trevor standing there. He looked terrible, his face pale and drawn, his tie loosened and his jacket rumpled. He glanced over his shoulder as if checking to make sure no one was watching, then stepped into the small room with me. "Natalie, I'm so sorry," he said immediately, his voice low and urgent. "I should have stopped her. I knew something was wrong. I knew she was planning something, but I couldn't." He ran a hand through his hair, making it stand up in stressed peaks. 2 days ago, I saw text messages on her phone. She'd left it on the bathroom counter while she was in the shower. I wasn't trying to snoop, but the screen lit up and I saw them. Someone was giving her instructions. Make sure the spill happens exactly as planned. The dress must be damaged beyond repair. Do this and your debts disappear. My stomach dropped. Someone paid her to ruin my dress. I confronted her about it. I told her whatever they were asking her to do, she couldn't do it. I said the dress was more important than she knew, that my father had mentioned something about historical textiles and legal complications. But she just laughed at me. She said I was being paranoid, that the texts were about a marketing stunt for her social media, some kind of staged drama for content. Trevor's voice cracked slightly. "I should have pushed harder. I should have called you or told my father or done something other than just let it go. But confrontation has never been my strong suit. And Vanessa was so angry when I questioned her that I backed down. I always back down." He pulled a manila folder from inside his jacket, slightly bent from being pressed against his body. The tab was labeled in neat handwriting, "Rhapsody Project." "I found this in my father's study 6 months ago when I was looking for some estate documents. I wasn't supposed to see it. I think he'd forgotten it was even there, buried under years of other papers. When I read it, I didn't understand most of it, but I knew it had something to do with the Whitman Foundation scandal from before I was born. After I saw those texts on Vanessa's phone, I went back and read it again more carefully." He pressed the folder into my hands. "This is why I tried to stop her, and why someone wanted that dress destroyed." I took the folder from Trevor's hands, feeling its weight, both physical and metaphorical. He looked at me with such desperate guilt that I almost felt sorry for him, but sympathy would have to wait. There were more immediate concerns, starting with the document that Vanessa had signed before collapsing. "Trevor," I said carefully, "that paper I gave Vanessa, do you still have it? The one she dropped." He patted his jacket pocket reflexively. "Yes, I picked it up. I didn't want anyone else reading it." "Natalie, what exactly did you give her?" "A legal document. I need it back." He hesitated, then pulled the folded paper from his pocket and handed it to me. I smoothed it out, checking that Vanessa's signature was still clearly visible at the bottom, along with the date and time I'd written in before the ceremony. The notary's seal was embossed in the corner, official and irreversible. The document read, "Acknowledgement of intentional damage to insured property. I, Vanessa Gordon, hereby acknowledge that on this date, I deliberately and with full knowledge damaged a fine arts textile piece known as Rhapsody 12, currently insured under policy number WT47821 with Whitmore & Pike specialty coverage for the appraised value of $1.2 million. I understand that this action constitutes willful destruction of historically significant property, and that I accept full legal responsibility for forensic investigation. Potential criminal charges under Massachusetts General Laws, Chapter 266. Section 127 and civil liability for replacement value or restoration costs, as determined by certified appraisers. I sign this document of my own free will and with full understanding of its contents. Trevor read over my shoulder, and I heard him inhale sharply. She signed this. Vanessa actually signed this. She did, right before Gerald told her what the dress really was. I folded the document and tucked it into my pocket alongside Gerald's business card. In her panic, she probably thought it was just a damage waiver, something to acknowledge the spill happened. She didn't read it carefully. "This is a confession," Trevor said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is legally binding evidence that she did it on purpose." "Yes," I met his eyes. "Aunt May taught me something years ago, back when I was dealing with a problem at the library. A coworker who was stealing rare books and then claiming they'd been misfiled. May said the best way to get justice isn't to accuse someone and hope you can prove it. The best way is to make the guilty party sign their own confession without realizing it. Justice works best when the criminal hands you the evidence." Trevor looked like he might be sick. "You planned this. You knew she was going to spill wine on your dress, and you let it happen." "I prepared for the possibility," I corrected. "2 weeks ago, I went to considerable trouble to set things up properly. I had the dress professionally appraised and photographed by a certified fine arts assessor. I videotaped myself that morning wearing it in perfect condition with clear footage of every detail, every stitch, the pristine ivory silk. I had 3 witnesses. Sarah Daniels' mother and the woman who did my hair sign notarized affidavits stating they'd seen the dress in flawless condition before the ceremony. I took out a specialized insurance policy through Whitmore and Pike Specialty Coverage, and I specifically told the agent that intentional damage was a possibility given the dress's history and value." "Why would you do all that unless you knew?" Trevor asked. "I thought about that phone call 2 weeks ago, Vanessa's voice carrying from my bathroom where she'd gone to take what she'd said was an important business call. She'd left her phone on my kitchen counter when she came out, and it had rung while she was getting her coat. I'd glanced at the screen, seen an unknown number, and then the voicemail notification had popped up. I shouldn't have listened. It was an invasion of privacy, the kind of thing the old Natalie would never have done. But something in my gut told me to pick up that phone and play the message. The voice had been female, older, with the kind of crisp authority that comes from decades of getting exactly what you want. "Vanessa, this is your final instruction. During the toast at your sister's wedding, you will spill red wine on her dress. Make it look accidental, stumble, apologize, play the embarrassed sister. The dress must be damaged beyond repair. Do this exactly as I've outlined, and I will personally ensure your debts are cleared within 48 hours. Fail, and I will make certain those investors pursue legal action. You have one chance to get this right." I'd stood in my kitchen, Vanessa's phone in my hand, listening to that message 3 times. I could have confronted my sister right then. I could have demanded to know who was threatening her and why. I could have called off the wedding or hidden the dress or done any number of things to prevent what was clearly a planned attack. Instead, I'd deleted the message, put the phone back exactly where Vanessa had left it, and started making calls of my own. I overheard something. I told Trevor now, keeping my explanation vague. Enough to know that someone wanted my dress destroyed and was using Vanessa to do it. I could have stopped it, but then I would never have known who was really behind it or why. The insurance policy I purchased has a specific clause if damage is determined to be intentional rather than accidental. The company automatically refers the case for criminal investigation. Whitmore and Pike has a reputation in the art world. They don't settle. They don't make quiet agreements. They investigate thoroughly, they document everything, and they press charges whenever possible. If the dress is valuable enough and crosses state lines, federal agencies get involved. Trevor had gone even paler. "Federal agencies? You mean the FBI?" "Potentially, yes. Art fraud, destruction of cultural property, conspiracy. These are serious charges when you're talking about $1 million piece with historical significance." I pulled out my phone and checked the time. The reception had been going on for nearly 2 hours now, though it felt like days. The trap wasn't just for Vanessa Trevor. It was for whoever put her up to this, whoever sent those text messages you saw, whoever promised to clear her debts in exchange for destroying evidence. Evidence. Trevor repeated, looking down at the folder he'd given me. The dress isn't just valuable because it's beautiful or rare. It actually contains proof of the embezzlement. That's what Gerald suggested. Financial records encoded in the stitching. I thought about May's careful hands working by lamplight in her small shop, keeping this dress safe for over 50 years. What had she known? What had she been protecting? Sarah appeared at the door of the small room, slightly out of breath. "Natalie, there you are. I've been looking everywhere. Are you okay? People are starting to ask questions and Vanessa's refusing to talk to anyone." She stopped when she saw Trevor, then looked between us. "What's going on?" "Sarah, I need to ask you something," I said. "Did you know I was going to let Vanessa spill wine on my dress?" My friend's face went carefully blank in that way it did when she was deciding how honest to be. Finally, she said, "I suspected. You were too calm, too prepared. When you asked me to sign that affidavit about the dress's condition this morning, and when you made sure the videographer got footage of you getting ready, I wondered. Then when it actually happened and you just stood there like you'd been expecting it." She paused. "Did you know for certain?" "I knew it was a strong possibility." "Then why let it happen?" Sarah asked the question I knew was coming. "Why not just stop her?" I looked at the wine stain spreading across my dress, ruining what should have been the most beautiful day of my life, but somehow feeling like the beginning of something necessary. Sometimes the only way to catch the spider is to let it think the web is working. My phone buzzed in my hand. I looked down at the screen and saw a message from an unknown number with a Massachusetts area code. The text read, "Ms. Gordon, this is Ruth Delgado from Whitmore and Pike Specialty Coverage. Your claim has been flagged for priority investigation. Our forensic investigator arrives tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. We've already identified 3 names for questioning: Vanessa Gordon, Trevor Whitman, and Elaine Whitman. Please do not discuss this case with anyone before our interview." I stared at the message on my phone screen, reading those 3 names over and over. Vanessa Gordon, Trevor Whitman, and Elaine Whitman. The investigator was coming tomorrow morning, and suddenly everything May had set in motion was becoming terrifyingly real. I looked up to find both Sarah and Trevor watching me, waiting for an explanation I wasn't ready to give. Before I could speak, there was a sharp knock on the door. Gerald opened it without waiting for permission. His face flushed and his breathing slightly labored as if he'd been hurrying. "Natalie, I need to speak with you privately. Now, please." Sarah and Trevor exchanged glances. My friend touched my arm and said, "I'll go check on Daniel. He's been fielding questions from guests." Trevor nodded and followed her out, though he cast one last worried look back at his father before disappearing into the reception hall. Gerald closed the door and leaned against it for a moment, composing himself. When he turned to face me, I saw that the careful, measured curator from earlier had been replaced by someone far more desperate. There was sweat beading at his temples despite the cool temperature of the room, and he kept pulling his phone from his pocket, checking the screen, then putting it away again with shaking hands. "I need to make you an offer," he said without preamble. "I want to buy that dress from you. Right now, tonight. I'll write you a check for $1.5 million. That's more than the appraised value, and you won't have to deal with insurance companies or investigations or any of the complications that are about to come down on all of us." I kept my expression neutral, though my heart was racing. "That's a generous offer." "It's a fair offer for everyone involved." Gerald moved closer, his voice dropping to an urgent whisper. "This investigation that's coming, it's going to be embarrassing for everyone, Natalie. Your sister will face charges. Trevor will be questioned about what he knew and when. The Whitman name will be dragged through every newspaper in New England. And you'll be at the center of a media circus, your wedding day remembered not for joy, but for scandal." He ran a hand through his silver hair. "I'm trying to protect the family from all of that. My family and yours." "My family," I repeated softly. You keep saying that as if we're connected somehow." He didn't answer, just pulled out his phone again, stared at it, then shoved it back in his pocket. $2 million, he said abruptly. "I'll give you $2 million. Cash transfer completed by Monday morning. All you have to do is sign over ownership of the dress to me and agree not to pursue the insurance claim." The desperation in his voice was palpable now, and it told me more than any amount of money could. Whatever was in this dress, whatever evidence May had preserved in the fabric, Gerald was terrified of it being discovered. "Please," he continued, and there was real fear in his eyes now. "You don't understand what you're dealing with. If the insurance investigators start examining that dress properly, if they bring in forensic textile experts and decode the stitching patterns, they'll find things that should stay buried. Things that will destroy people who don't deserve to be destroyed." I thought about the business card in my pocket, about the impossible words he'd written on the back. "I think I might be your father." I thought about my mother, Sarah, who'd raised 2 daughters alone and died still believing she'd somehow failed us. I thought about May, slowly poisoned in her final years by someone desperate to get this dress. "You seemed very calm when the wine spilled," Gerald said, watching me carefully now. "Almost like you were expecting it." I met his eyes and made a decision. If he was going to be honest with me, I needed to be honest with him. "A good sister always knows what her family is capable of," I said quietly. "I simply created the opportunity." Gerald's face went slack with shock. You knew Vanessa was going to do it." "I heard the phone call 2 weeks ago. Someone with authority in their voice, someone who clearly had power over my sister, instructed her to spill red wine on this dress during the toast. They promised to clear her debts if she succeeded." I smoothed my hand over the wine-stained silk. I knew someone had manipulated Vanessa into doing this. But I also knew that if I stopped it, whoever is behind this would just try something else. They'd find another way to destroy the evidence. So I wore the real dress, I stood in exactly the right spot, and I let it happen on my terms. I made sure it was documented, witnessed, legally actionable. Gerald stared at me as if seeing me for the first time, and slowly his expression shifted from shock to something that looked almost like pride. "You set a trap," he said. "You used yourself as bait." "I used the dress as bait. I was just the model." I paused, studying his face. "You're more frightened now than you were before. Why? Because I'm not a victim you can pay off, because I'm someone who plans ahead." "You're more like your mother than you know," Gerald said, his voice barely audible. "Sarah would have done exactly the same thing. She was brilliant, strategic, always 3 steps ahead of everyone around her. She saw through people, understood their motivations, knew how to position herself to control outcomes." He looked at me with an expression mixing fear and something deeper, something almost tender. "God, you even have her way of tilting your head when you're analyzing someone." The intimacy in his voice made my skin prickle. "You keep mentioning my mother as if you knew her personally," I said, hearing the edge in my own voice. "We've never met before Vanessa's wedding to Trevor 3 years ago. I never saw you at any family gatherings before that. I certainly never saw you at my mother's funeral. So, how would you know anything about Sarah Gordon? How would you know her mannerisms, or her strategic mind, or anything else about her?" Gerald's face went pale, and I saw him struggle with something internal, some decision about how much truth to tell. His mouth opened, then closed. He took a step toward me, then stopped. Finally he whispered, "Because I know exactly who you really are, Natalie. I know whose daughter you are. And if this dress reveals what I think it will, if those investigators decode the information May preserved in the fabric, everyone else is going to know too. They're going to know about the foundation scandal, about the embezzlement, about Margaret's death, and what really happened in 1971. But they're also going to know about 1986, about your mother and me, about the choices we made and the daughter we couldn't protect." Before I could respond, before I could process what he was saying, Gerald turned toward the door. But I wasn't ready to let him leave, not with so many questions unanswered. I took a step after him, and as I moved, I felt something strange beneath my hand where it rested against the dress's hem. A ridge in the fabric that hadn't been there before, or perhaps that I simply hadn't noticed. I ran my fingers along it carefully, and yes, there was definitely something sewn into the lining. Something small and flat, like a piece of paper or card carefully hidden in the silk. Gerald saw me touching the hem, and his eyes widened. "Don't," he said urgently. "Not here. Not yet. Wait until after the investigators come. Wait until you have protection." He pulled open the door, then paused and looked back at me one last time. "I tried to buy that dress to protect you, Natalie, not to protect myself or the family reputation. To protect you from what's coming. Because once that investigation starts, once they find what's hidden in that fabric, there will be people who see you as a threat. Dangerous people. People who have spent 50 years keeping secrets buried, and they won't hesitate to bury you alongside them." The reception ended shortly after 10 o'clock, with guests departing in awkward clusters, whispering about the drama they'd witnessed. Daniel and I checked into a small hotel near the church, the honeymoon suite we'd booked weeks ago, now feeling surreal given everything that had happened. He held me for a long time without speaking, sensing that I needed silence more than comfort. Then finally kissed my forehead and said he was going to take a shower. The moment I heard the bathroom door close, I carefully removed the wine-stained dress and laid it across the bed. The fabric looked worse under the harsh hotel lighting, the burgundy stains spread across the bodice like a wound. But I wasn't looking at the damage anymore. I was looking at the hem, at the place where my fingers had felt that strange ridge. I'd brought my small sewing kit from home, the one May had given me years ago, with the inscription, "For repairs both visible and hidden," engraved on the tin lid. Inside was a seam ripper, small and precise, the kind used for delicate work. I knelt beside the bed and examined the hem more carefully. The stitching was extraordinarily fine, almost invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. May's work without question. I recognized her signature technique of using thread that matched the fabric so perfectly it seemed to disappear into the weave. But this wasn't original construction. This had been added later, a modification so subtle that even an expert might miss it. I positioned the seam ripper against the nearly invisible stitches and began working them loose, one tiny thread at a time. It took me 20 minutes to open a section about 4 inches long. Beneath the outer layer of silk was a small pocket expertly constructed, and inside that pocket was something wrapped in fabric. I extracted it carefully, a tiny envelope made from ivory cloth sealed with silver thread that caught the light when I turned it. My hands were trembling as I used the seam ripper to cut through the silver threads, and when I finally opened the envelope, a piece of yellowed paper slid into my palm. The document was old, the paper brittle at the edges, and slightly discolored with age. Across the top, printed in the formal typeface of official documents from the 1970s, were the words, "Whitman Foundation, Charitable Trust Authorization of Funds Transfer." The date read March 15, 1971. Below that, a description, "Transfer of $850,000 from Foundation Operating Account to Cayman International Holdings Account, number 847-2956B, for purposes of educational grant distribution as authorized by Board of Trustees." 2 signatures appeared at the bottom. The first read, G. Whitman, in a shaky, uncertain hand, the signature of someone young and uncomfortable with the authority they were claiming. The second signature was bold and confident, E. Porter Whitman, Executive Director. Below the official document in handwriting I recognized immediately as May's was a note written in pencil. The letters faded but still legible. Gerald was forced. Elaine chose. The girl in the dress knew both truths. I read the note 3 times, my mind racing. Gerald would have been only 16 in 1971, far too young to have legitimate authority over foundation finances. His signature had to have been obtained through coercion or outright forgery. But Elaine Porter Whitman, this was a name I'd never heard before, someone with the title of executive director and clear control over the trust. The same woman Gerald had mentioned earlier, the one he'd said ran the foundation after Margaret's death. I pulled out my phone and photographed the document from multiple angles, making sure every word was clearly captured. The flash seemed too bright in the dim hotel room, and I worried irrationally that someone outside might see the light and know what I'd found. I was being paranoid, but Gerald's warning echoed in my mind. Dangerous people. People who have spent 50 years keeping secrets buried. I heard the shower shut off in the bathroom and quickly began tucking the document back into its cloth envelope. But before I could seal it away again, I heard a sharp knock at the hotel room door. Not the polite knock of hotel staff, but something urgent and aggressive. I froze the document still in my hand. "Natalie?" Vanessa's voice came through the door, loud and slurred. "Natalie, I know you're in there. Open the door. We need to talk. We need to talk right now." I shoved the document into the pocket of my robe and moved toward the door, checking the peephole. Vanessa stood in the hallway, her hair disheveled, makeup smeared down her cheeks in dark streaks, still wearing her bridesmaid dress. She was alone, swaying slightly, and as I watched, she raised her fist to pound on the door again. I opened it before she could make more noise and wake other guests. "Vanessa, what are you?" She pushed past me into the room, her eyes wild and unfocused. She'd been drinking heavily, that much was obvious, but there was something else too, a desperation that went beyond alcohol. She saw the dress spread across the bed, saw the opened hem, and her face contorted with panic. "What did you find?" she demanded, her voice breaking. "What did May hide in that dress?" "Vanessa, you need to leave. This isn't the time. Show me." She lunged toward the bed, toward the dress, and I moved to intercept her. But she was faster than I expected, grabbing the fabric and pulling it toward her. I caught her wrist, trying to pry her fingers loose, and suddenly we were in a physical struggle, both of us pulling at the dress and at each other. "You can't show anyone that!" Vanessa screamed, tears streaming down her face. "Whatever you found, whatever May left, you can't show it to the investigators. They'll destroy me. They'll destroy all of us. Trevor will go to prison, and it'll be my fault because I was stupid enough to believe her lies." I shoved her backward hard enough that she stumbled and fell against the hotel room wall. The document slipped from my robe pocket and landed on the carpet between us. We both stared at it, and I saw recognition flash across her face, even though she couldn't possibly read it from that distance. "She showed you something," I said, my voice cold and controlled despite the adrenaline flooding my system. "Elaine. She showed you documentation, told you what was at stake. That's why you were so terrified after you spilled the wine. That's why you fainted when Gerald whispered in your ear. You knew this dress contained evidence of something, didn't you?" Vanessa's face crumpled, all her beauty dissolving into raw anguish. She slid down the wall until she was sitting on the floor, her expensive dress pooling around her like a discarded costume. "I didn't know what it was," she sobbed. "I swear I didn't know exactly what. She just said the dress was dangerous, that it contained information that could destroy the Whitman family and anyone connected to them. She said if I didn't spill the wine and ruin it, she'd make sure Trevor was charged with fraud for work he did for his law firm. She had documents showing he'd helped clients hide money from the IRS, and she said she'd turn them over to federal prosecutors." "And you believed her," I said quietly. "Of course I believed her." Vanessa's voice rose hysterically. "You don't know what she's like, Natalie. Elaine Whitman isn't some nice old lady. She's terrifying. She knows things about everyone, has files on everyone, and she doesn't make empty threats. Trevor's been scared of her his entire life, and when she contacted me 6 weeks ago, when she told me what she wanted me to do, I knew if I didn't do it, she'd destroy everything." Her hands were shaking violently as she wrapped them around herself. But that wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was what she promised me if I succeeded. I picked up the document from the floor and held it carefully. "What did she promise you?" Through her tears, Vanessa whispered, "She said if I didn't spill the wine, she'd send Trevor to prison for fraud, and she'd make sure I lost everything, including you." I stared at my sister sitting crumpled on the hotel room floor, mascara streaking her face, her carefully constructed image completely shattered. Part of me wanted to comfort her, to pull her into my arms the way I had when we were children, and she'd wake from nightmares. But another part of me, the part that had spent the entire evening being humiliated in front of 80 guests, needed to understand exactly how deep this betrayal went. "Start at the beginning," I said, sitting down on the edge of the bed, still holding the yellowed document. "Tell me everything." Vanessa wiped her face with the back of her hand, smearing her makeup even worse. 6 weeks ago, I got a text message from an unknown number. It came at 3 in the morning, and I almost didn't look at it, but then my phone kept buzzing with attachments coming through. Her voice was hoarse from crying. The message said, "Your husband helped his clients hide $5 million from the IRS. I have proof. Do exactly as I say, or I send everything to federal prosecutors." Then there were photos Trevor at his desk signing documents, meeting with clients I recognized from news articles about tax fraud cases. And there were copies of emails, memos, things that looked so damning I couldn't breathe. I thought about Trevor's guilty face at the reception, the way he'd known something terrible was coming, but hadn't been able to stop it. Were the documents real? "I don't know," Vanessa said miserably. "They looked real. The signatures looked like Trevor's handwriting. But Trevor swears he never did anything illegal, that he just provided standard legal counsel within the bounds of the law. Either someone fabricated incredibly convincing forgeries, or Trevor's been lying to me for years, and I honestly don't know which is worse." She pulled her knees up to her chest, making herself small. The texts kept coming after that. Instructions. Specific things I had to do. I had to start calling you more often, had to act interested in your wedding planning, had to volunteer to be a bridesmaid even though we both know we haven't been close in years. "You were gathering information," I said quietly, "about the dress." "I didn't know it was about the dress at first. The messages just told me to get closer to you, to find out details about the wedding, to report back on what you were wearing and where you were getting it from. Then 3 weeks ago, the tone changed. The messages became more urgent. Find out everything about her wedding dress. Where did she get it? Who made it? Is it old or new? I tried to ask you. Casually, remember? At that lunch we had when you showed me your final alterations." I did remember. Vanessa had seemed unusually interested in the dress, asking questions about where it came from, whether it was vintage, if it had any history. I'd thought she was just being sisterly, taking an interest in my wedding. "What did you tell them?" "That your Aunt May had left it to you, that it was old and beautiful, and you said it was special, but you didn't know much about its history." After I sent that information, there was silence for almost a week. Then the final instructions came. Vanessa's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "At the reception, during the toast, spill red wine on her dress. Make it look accidental, but make sure the damage is severe and irreversible. Do this exactly as instructed, and I'll destroy all evidence against Trevor. I'll also take care of your business debts, $200,000 paid off anonymously within 48 hours. The bathroom door opened, and Daniel emerged in his pajamas, his hair still wet from the shower. He took one look at Vanessa on the floor, and me holding the old document, and his expression shifted from surprise to quiet understanding. "I'll give you two some privacy," he said, grabbing his phone and hotel room key. "I'll be in the lobby if you need me." He kissed the top of my head as he passed a gesture of support that made my throat tighten with gratitude. After he left, Vanessa continued. "The messages were all signed E.W. At first I thought it might be Emma Wu, this woman who invested in my boutique and lost money when it failed. She'd been angry, threatened to sue me, so it seemed possible she'd want revenge. But 2 days before your wedding, I received a message that made everything clear. It said, 'This is Elaine Whitman. Trevor is my stepson, but that won't save him if you disobey me. I protected the Whitman name for 53 years, and I won't let some cheap wedding dress destroy everything.' Elaine Whitman." I repeated the name Gerald had mentioned. Trevor's stepmother. Gerald's second wife technically, though she raised Trevor after his mother died when he was young. I tried to warn Trevor about the messages, showed him everything on my phone. But he just laughed and said Elaine was bitter and powerless, that she'd been pushed out of foundation business after Gerald's father died, and had no real authority anymore. He said she liked to make threats but couldn't actually hurt anyone. Vanessa's laugh was bitter and broken. So I did what I do best, I researched. I spent hours online looking up Elaine Whitman's history. Natalie, she's terrifying. There are traces of her everywhere if you know where to look. Business rivals who suddenly faced IRS audits. Journalists who were going to write exposés about the foundation who got fired or discredited. Critics who had accidents or health crises right when they were about to go public with information. Nothing you could prove, nothing that would hold up in court, but too many coincidences to ignore. I thought about the document in my hands about evidence preserved for 50 years about a woman desperate enough to murder May slowly with poison. You were scared. I was terrified, Vanessa admitted. But more than that, I was desperate. The debt collectors were calling every day. My marriage was falling apart under the financial stress. I kept thinking about how you'd always been the strong one, the one who survived everything while I fell apart at the smallest problems. I told myself you'd be fine, that you'd understand eventually, that you always forgave me because that's what big sisters do. Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. I knew what I was doing was wrong. I knew you'd be hurt. But I thought I was protecting my husband, saving my marriage, and maybe finally getting out from under the debt that's been crushing me. I thought after the wedding, after some time passed, I'd confess everything, and we'd fight Elaine together. You're smart, Natalie. You always figure things out. I thought you'd help me fix it. Instead, I let you do exactly what Elaine wanted, I said. I gave you the opportunity and documented every second of it. Vanessa's face crumpled again. When Gerald whispered in my ear what that dress really was when he told me it was worth over $1 million and was evidence in an old criminal case, I realized I hadn't just ruined your wedding. I'd walked into a trap 50 years in the making. I'd helped destroy evidence of crimes I didn't even understand. And now investigators are coming, and I'm going to prison, and Trevor's going to prison, and it's all my fault. I looked at the document again, at May's handwriting. Gerald was forced. Elaine chose. My aunt had known the difference between victims and villains, between people who had no choice and people who chose evil. I thought about everything Vanessa had just told me, and I made a decision. You're not going to prison, I said quietly. Not if you help me now. Not if you tell the investigators everything Elaine said and did. You were manipulated, Vanessa. You were a victim too. She looked up at me with red, swollen eyes. Why would you help me after what I did to you? I didn't have a good answer for that, or maybe I had too many answers. Because she was my sister. Because I understood what it meant to be desperate. Because May had taught me that justice wasn't the same as revenge. What did Elaine promise you in return? I asked quietly. Besides clearing your debts, what else did she offer that made you willing to betray me? Vanessa went very still, and I saw something shift in her expression, shame mixed with a longing so deep it made her look like a child again. She was silent for a long moment, and when she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. She said she'd tell me who my real father is. The words hung in the air between us, and I felt something fundamental shift in my understanding of my sister. All her life, Vanessa had been searching for an identity that made sense, a father who chose to stay instead of one who walked away. Elaine had found the one thing my sister wanted more than money or status or even self-respect, and she'd used it as a weapon. Get some sleep, I told her finally. Tomorrow morning the investigator comes. You're going to tell her everything you just told me, every text message, every threat, every promise Elaine made. And then we're going to find out the truth together about the dress, about the foundation, about our family. All of it. Vanessa nodded, wiping her face one more time, and left the hotel room without another word. I heard her footsteps fade down the hallway, unsteady but determined. Daniel returned a few minutes later, and I showed him the document, explained what Vanessa had revealed, and watched his expression shift from shock to grim resolve. We didn't sleep much that night. Ruth Delgado arrived at exactly 9 o'clock the next morning as promised. I'd been expecting someone severe and intimidating, but the woman who knocked on our hotel room door looked more like a favorite aunt than an investigator. She was 62 years old with silver-streaked dark hair pulled back in a practical bun, wearing a navy blazer and slacks that spoke of professional competence without ostentation. But her eyes were sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses, and when she shook my hand, her grip was firm and assessing. "Mrs. Chen, I presume," she said, her voice carrying the precise diction of someone who chose her words carefully. "I'm Ruth Delgado from Whitmore and Pike Specialty Coverage. Thank you for making time to meet with me so promptly after your wedding. I understand this is hardly ideal timing." "Nothing about this situation is ideal," I said, stepping aside to let her enter. Daniel had already left to give us privacy, taking the Rhapsody Project folder with him to review in the hotel coffee shop. "But I appreciate you coming so quickly." Ruth settled into the desk chair and pulled out a tablet and a small recording device. "I need to inform you that this conversation will be recorded for insurance and potential legal purposes. Do I have your permission to proceed?" "Yes." She pressed a button on the device and stated the date, time, and both our names for the record. Then she looked at me with those sharp eyes and said, "Let me be direct, Mrs. Chen. This isn't a routine insurance claim. The combination of factors here, the dress's provenance and historical significance, the signed acknowledgement of intentional damage, and the property's connection to an unsolved 1971 embezzlement case, has elevated this to a matter requiring potential federal involvement. I'm not here to mediate family disputes or assess accident versus negligence. I'm here to document facts, preserve evidence, and determine if criminal charges are warranted under state or federal law." "I understand," I said, though my heart was racing. Federal involvement meant this was bigger than I'd fully grasped. Ruth pulled up a file on her tablet. "I've reviewed the witness statements from your reception. 83 guests, and at least 40 of them reported seeing your sister Vanessa deliberately pour wine on your dress. The language in their statements is remarkably consistent. Words like deliberate, intentional, and staged appear repeatedly." She looked up at me. "Your sister didn't make much effort to hide what she was doing. She was following instructions," I said, then explained Vanessa's confession from the night before the blackmail texts, Elaine Whitman's threats. Ruth listened without interrupting, taking notes on her tablet with quick, efficient movements. When I finished, she asked, "Do you have documentation of these text messages?" "Vanessa has them on her phone. She's prepared to show them to you." "Good. I'll need to speak with her separately." Ruth scrolled through her notes, and I saw her pause on something. "One name keeps appearing in the witness statements, Gerald Whitman. He was the one who first reacted to your dress, correct? The one who whispered to your sister and caused her to faint." "Yes, he's Vanessa's father-in-law, married to her husband Trevor." "Gerald Whitman," Ruth repeated, and I caught something in her tone. Recognition, perhaps, or old memory surfacing. Would that be the same Gerald Whitman who was a curator at the New England Museum of Textile Arts in the 1970s? "It is. He told me he worked there when the Rhapsody collection was commissioned." Ruth nodded slowly and made a notation that I couldn't see. I thought the name was familiar. I worked as a forensic accountant for the Massachusetts Attorney General's office in the 1990s. We attempted to reopen the Whitman Foundation case, $3 million stolen from a charitable trust, all trails going cold, in 1971. It was one of those frustrating situations where everyone involved knew a crime had occurred, but we couldn't gather enough evidence to prosecute anyone still living. Gerald Whitman's name appeared extensively in the files, but he was a minor at the time of the original embezzlement, only 16 years old, so charges were never pursued against him. "But his signature is on transfer documents," I said, thinking of the paper I'd found in the dress's hem. "Precisely," which raised questions about whether he was coerced or whether the signatures were outright forgeries. Ruth set down her tablet and looked at me directly. "May I see the dress, Mrs. Chen, and any documents you may have found within it?" I retrieved the dress from where I'd carefully laid it over the bathroom door to air out. The wine stain had dried to a dark maroon, even more dramatic in the morning light. Ruth examined it with the focused attention of an expert, running her fingers along the seams, studying the stitching patterns, pulling out a small magnifying glass to look more closely at the hem where I'd opened May's hidden pocket. "Extraordinary work," she murmured half to herself. "Your aunt wasn't just skilled, she was methodical. This modification was done decades after the original construction. You can see where the original hemstitching is slightly oxidized, the thread aged differently. But this hidden pocket uses period-appropriate thread, probably vintage stock she'd saved with modern knotting techniques. She wanted it to integrate seamlessly with the original garment, but she also wanted it to last. She was building something meant to survive for generations, if necessary." Ruth pulled out her phone and began photographing the dress from multiple angles, paying special attention to the decorative stitching along the bodice and sleeves. "The encoding is here," she said, tracing a pattern of silver thread that I'd always thought was merely decorative. "These aren't random embellishments, they're mathematical sequences. Your Aunt May didn't create this encoding that was the original designer L. Whitman, but May preserved it perfectly. She understood what she had." I showed Ruth the document I'd found, explaining exactly where it had been hidden and how I'd discovered it. She photographed it extensively, then sat back and looked at me with an expression that mixed professional satisfaction with something deeper, personal investment perhaps, or old wounds being reopened. "I tried to interview your aunt in 1998, Ruth said quietly, "as part of our investigation into the foundation. She refused to speak to me formally, said she was just a seamstress and knew nothing about financial crimes. But 3 days after I contacted her, I received an anonymous letter at my office. It was typed unsigned, but I always suspected it came from her. The letter said, 'The evidence still exists, sewn into truth that someone will wear one day. When the wine spills, look for silver thread.' I thought it was the rambling of someone paranoid or possibly mentally unwell. I filed it away and eventually forgot about it." She smiled sadly. "Your aunt was many things, Mrs. Chen, but she wasn't mentally unwell. She was patient, she was strategic, and she was waiting for exactly this moment." Ruth handed me her business card, plain white, with just her name and contact information. "Your aunt wasn't just a seamstress protecting evidence, Natalie. She was a witness to a crime. And I think you need to know what really happened to your mother." Ruth's words echoed in my mind long after she'd left to interview Vanessa separately. "What really happened to your mother?" "My mother, Sarah, had died 8 years ago from what the doctors called heart failure. Stress-induced and accelerated by years of financial worry and emotional exhaustion. At least, that's what I'd always believed. Now I was beginning to wonder if there were layers to her death. I'd never examined connections to this 50-year-old conspiracy that I'd been too grief-stricken to see. I was still processing this when my phone rang. Trevor's name appeared on the screen, and I almost didn't answer. But something in the persistence of his calling 3 times in a row made me pick up. "Natalie, I need to see you," he said without preamble. His voice was rough, slurred slightly at the edges. "I have something you need to see, something I should have shown you months ago, but I was a coward. I'm still a coward, but at least now I'm a coward who's done hiding." There was a pause, and I heard ice clinking in a glass. "I'm in the hotel bar. Please, give me 10 minutes. I found him at a corner table, the Rhapsody Project folder sitting in front of him next to what looked like his 3rd or 4th whiskey. He'd aged a decade overnight. His face was gray, his eyes bloodshot, his normally neat hair disheveled as if he'd been running his hands through it compulsively. When he saw me, he gestured to the folder with something like desperation. "I found this 2 years ago," he said as I sat down across from him. "I was looking through my father's study for estate planning documents after he had that health scare, and I came across it buried under years of old papers. I don't think he remembered it was even there. When I read it, I didn't understand half of what I was seeing, but I knew it was dangerous. I knew it connected to things my family had spent decades trying to forget." He pushed the folder toward me. "I've been living with this knowledge for 2 years, watching Elaine manipulate everyone around her, and I did nothing. I told myself I was protecting my father, protecting the family name, but really I was just protecting myself from having to choose a side. I opened the folder. Inside were dozens of documents, some typed on old letterhead, some handwritten, some official-looking foundation papers with signatures and seals. The first document was a letter dated January 1971, written in elegant cursive on personal stationery embossed with L.W. The designer's full name was Lillian Whitman. Trevor said, watching me read. My grandmother, Gerald's mother. She married Richard Whitman in 1954, and they had one son, my father. She was passionate about textiles, about art, about using beauty to communicate truth. She was also heavily involved in running the Whitman Foundation with her husband. I scanned the letter, which detailed Lillian's growing concerns about irregularities in the foundation's accounts. Her tone was measured but alarmed, noting that grant applications were being approved for organizations that didn't seem to exist, that funds were being transferred to accounts she couldn't trace. The letter was addressed to Richard Whitman, her husband essentially warning him that someone was stealing from their charity. The next several documents told a story that became increasingly desperate. Elaine Porter had married into the family in 1970. She was only 20 years old, beautiful and charming, and Richard's distant cousin through some complicated family connection. Lillian's letters showed her initial attempts to welcome Elaine, then growing suspicion, then outright alarm as she began documenting evidence of systematic embezzlement. The letter from February 1971 made my hands shake. Lillian wrote, "I've commissioned a dozen dresses as evidence. Each one contains coded ledger information in the stitching account numbers, transfer dates, amounts. The designer who's creating them doesn't know what the codes mean, only that I've specified exact patterns. If something happens to me, these dresses will speak truth when I no longer can. I've told May Gordon, my seamstress and friend, where they're hidden. She'll know what to do." "She knew she was in danger," I said quietly. "She died 6 weeks after writing that letter," Trevor confirmed. "Car accident on a mountain road. Her vehicle went over a cliff. They said she lost control on a curve, but Lillian was a careful driver. My father was 16. He came home from school one day to find police at the house, his mother dead, and Elaine suddenly in charge of everything. Within a year, Elaine had married Richard and taken control of the foundation. The dresses disappeared. The investigation went nowhere. And Gerald spent the rest of his life knowing his mother had been murdered, but being unable to prove it." I continued reading through the file, and near the bottom I found a photograph. It was slightly faded but still clear, showing a young man I recognized as Gerald standing next to a woman who made my breath catch. My mother. Sarah. She was younger than I'd ever seen her in photos, maybe 30 years old, wearing jeans and a simple sweater, her hair longer than she'd worn it in my memory. Gerald's arm was around her shoulders, and they were both smiling at each other with an intimacy that couldn't be mistaken for anything but love. They stood in front of a storefront I recognized, May's seamstress shop, the sign visible behind them. I turned the photograph over with trembling hands. May's distinctive handwriting read, "Gerald and Sarah, the day we decided. May 1986. May 1986. 9 months before I was born in February 1987. My father never told me directly," Trevor said, his voice barely above a whisper. "He's always been careful, always protective of secrets. But last year, when he was in the hospital recovering from pneumonia, they had him on some strong pain medications, and he got confused. He thought I was someone else, maybe his own father. He started talking about his regrets about the daughter he never got to raise." Trevor met my eyes. He said, "I have a daughter I never got to raise. She has Sarah's eyes and her grandmother's hands. If something happens to me, make sure Natalie knows she wasn't abandoned. She was protected." The bar seemed to tilt around me. I gripped the edge of the table, trying to steady myself against the weight of this revelation. Gerald was my father. The man who'd tried to buy the dress, who'd warned me about danger, who'd looked at me with that mixture of fear and tenderness. He was my father. "There's one more thing," Trevor said. He flipped to the last page in the folder, and I saw it was a pre-printed form from a genetic testing laboratory. The header read Paternity Test Request Form, and below it in Gerald's handwriting was a note, "For when she's ready to know the truth. GW." The form was already signed by Gerald, dated 6 months ago, waiting only for my signature and a DNA sample to confirm what the photograph and his drugged confession had already revealed. He'd been preparing for this moment, knowing that eventually the truth would surface, wanting to give me the choice of whether to pursue it officially. I sat in the hotel bar holding a photograph of my parents, because that's what they were. I realized with a shock that went bone deep and felt the foundations of my identity shifting beneath me. Gerald Whitman was my father. Sarah Gordon had loved him enough to protect his secret for 39 years. And May had been the keeper of all these truths, stitching them into fabric and waiting for the right moment to reveal them. Trevor ordered another drink, though he barely touched it. "I need to tell you about Elaine," he said. "Not the version she presents to the world, the elegant philanthropist, the guardian of the Whitman legacy. The real Elaine. The one who's been destroying people for half a century." Ruth had returned from interviewing Vanessa and joined us at the table, bringing with her a laptop and several files of her own. She'd been building a profile of Elaine Whitman for years, she explained, ever since the 1990s investigation that had gone nowhere. Now, with Trevor's files and Vanessa's testimony, the picture was finally becoming complete. Elaine Porter was born in 1950 to a middle-class family in Connecticut. Ruth began pulling up documents on her screen. Intelligent, beautiful, ambitious, and utterly without conscience. She was 20 years old when she met Richard Whitman at a charity gala in Boston. He was 60, recently widowed after Lillian's death, grieving and vulnerable. Elaine saw an opportunity and seized it. Within 6 months, they were married. Within a year, she had complete control over the foundation's finances. Trevor leaned forward, his voice bitter. "My grandfather Richard wasn't stupid, but he was trusting. He believed in people's goodness. Elaine exploited that. She convinced him that she wanted to honor Lillian's memory by expanding the foundation's work, and he gave her the authority to do it." Ruth clicked through several scanned documents showing grant approvals, fund transfers, and organizational registrations. Elaine's method was sophisticated for the early 1970s, though it would be considered relatively simple by today's standards. She created legitimate-looking charitable organizations, scholarship funds, community centers, art preservation societies, all with compelling mission statements and proper paperwork. The foundation would approve grants to these organizations, transfer the money, and the organizations would submit reports showing appropriate use of funds. What the foundation didn't know was that Elaine controlled every single one of these organizations through shell companies and proxy board members. "She was stealing from a charity," I said, feeling sick, "from money meant to help people." "Educational scholarships that never reached students," Ruth confirmed. "Community programs that never actually operated. Over 50 years, we estimate she's stolen approximately $12 million. But here's what made her nearly impossible to catch. She replenished just enough money to avoid obvious gaps. She'd steal $1 million, then use $200,000 of it to fund a few legitimate grants, so the foundation looked active and successful. Auditors would review the books and see grants being awarded, programs being funded, all the paperwork in order. They never dug deep enough to discover that most of the organizations were phantoms." Trevor pulled out another section of the Rhapsody Project files, this one containing what looked like a dossier. But theft was only part of what Elaine did. Her true genius was in creating a web of control. She identified vulnerable people, people with secrets, people with debts, people with ambitions, and she bound them to her. She forced me to sign documents creating offshore accounts and shell corporations, always telling me it was standard tax optimization for wealthy clients. Then she kept copies of everything with my signature, building a case against me that she could activate any time I disobeyed. She did the same thing with at least 30 other people over the years. Ruth added, her voice tight with professional frustration. Politicians who received campaign donations from her fake organizations. Journalists who were about to publish exposés about the foundation who suddenly faced career-ending scandals. Business rivals who experienced convenient IRS audits. Critics who had accidents or health crises right when they were about to go public. We could never prove any of it conclusively, but the pattern was undeniable. I thought about Vanessa, about the threats and promises that had turned my sister into a weapon against me. She finds what people want most and uses it to control them. Exactly, Ruth said. With Vanessa, it was debt relief and the promise of learning her father's identity. With Trevor, it was the threat of federal prosecution. With your father, she caught herself acknowledging the relationship openly. Now, with Gerald, it was threats against you. Elaine knew he had a daughter he'd never met, and she held that knowledge over him for decades. If he ever spoke up about what he knew regarding his mother's death or the Foundation's corruption, she'd destroy you. Trevor's hands were shaking as he reached for his drink. I've watched her operate my entire life. She raised me after my mother died when I was young. She was always kind to me, always supportive, but I saw what she did to others who crossed her. There was a Foundation board member when I was in college who started asking questions about grant distributions. He had a heart attack 3 weeks later. The doctor said it was natural, stress-induced, but I remember Elaine visiting him in the hospital, sitting by his bed with this smile that never reached her eyes. After he recovered, he resigned from the board and never spoke about the Foundation again. The Rhapsody dresses represent Elaine's greatest fear, Ruth said, bringing up an image of what looked like textile analysis. When Lillian Whitman commissioned them in 1970 and 1971, she used a technique of encoding financial data into the decorative stitching, account numbers disguised as floral patterns, transfer dates hidden in the spacing of pearls and beads, transaction amounts represented by the number of stitches in specific sequences. Lillian essentially created 12 wearable ledgers, each one containing fragments of evidence documenting Elaine's theft. After Lillian died, Elaine spent decades hunting them down, Trevor continued. She'd hire private investigators to track the dresses' ownership, then buy them through intermediaries, always paying far more than they were worth. She destroyed 11 of them, burned them, shredded them, made absolutely certain they couldn't be reconstructed. Only one escaped Rhapsody 12. May Gordon saved it the night Lillian died and kept it hidden for 53 years. Ruth pulled up what looked like a forensic textile report. If we can fully decode the stitching patterns on your dress, Natalie, we'll have documented evidence of the original embezzlement. More than that, we'll have a starting point to unravel everything Elaine has built on top of those initial crimes. 50 years of fraud, blackmail, and manipulation, all connected to that first theft. She reached for her phone, her expression darkening. There's something else you need to hear. I received a voicemail last night around midnight. The number was blocked, but I had it traced this morning. It came from a phone registered to a law firm that handles Elaine Whitman's personal legal affairs. Ruth pressed play, and a woman's voice filled the space between us, cultured cold, each word precisely enunciated. Ms. Delgado, this is Elaine Whitman. You seem determined to destroy a respectable family over old fabric and ancient history. I wonder if you've done your due diligence on the woman you're championing. Perhaps you should ask Natalie Gordon about her mother's suicide before you make her into a hero. Some families have more secrets than others, and not all of them reflect well on the people involved. I trust you'll make the right decision about how to proceed with this investigation. The message ended, and I sat frozen, my mother's name hanging in the air like an accusation. Suicide. Elaine had said suicide, not heart failure. And suddenly I was remembering things I'd pushed away 8 years ago, the way my mother's doctor had seemed uncomfortable when explaining her death, the way May had looked at me with such profound sadness when I'd asked if Mom had been in pain at the end. Your mother didn't die of heart failure, Ruth said gently. Did she? I couldn't answer Ruth's question, not there in the hotel bar with Trevor watching and the weight of Elaine's threat pressing down on me. Instead, I excused myself and drove to May's old shop, the building that had been closed since her death but which I couldn't bring myself to sell. I still had the key on my ring, a small brass one that May had pressed into my palm during one of my last visits to the hospice, whispering, When you need answers, go to the back office behind the filing cabinet. The shop smelled of dust and old fabric, that particular scent of a place where someone's life work had come to an end. May's sewing machines still sat on their tables covered with sheets. Bolts of fabric lined the walls. Her measuring tape hung on a hook by the door exactly where she'd left it. I walked through the front room and into the small back office where she'd done her bookkeeping and kept her private papers. The filing cabinet was exactly where it had always been, a battered metal thing from the 1960s that May had bought secondhand when she first opened the shop. I'd searched through it after her death, finding tax records and client files and invoices all neatly organized in her precise handwriting. But I hadn't known about the false panel at the back of the bottom drawer. I pulled the drawer completely out, setting it on the floor, and saw what May had meant. The back panel of the cabinet wasn't flush with the wall. There was a gap of about 3 inches. I reached in and felt along the metal until my fingers found a small latch. When I pressed it, a section of the panel swung open on hidden hinges, revealing a space that had been invisible from the outside. Inside was a manila envelope, thick with contents, addressed in May's handwriting, "To Natalie, open when the wine spills." My hands shook as I opened it. Inside was a letter several pages long, written on May's personal stationery with the small violet border she'd always loved. The handwriting was shaky, some words barely legible, the script of someone whose hands were failing them. The date at the top read, January 2022, 6 months before May died in June. "My darling girl," it began, and I heard May's voice so clearly I almost looked up expecting to see her standing there. "If you're reading this, it means you wore the dress and someone took the bait. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you while alive. Elaine was watching too closely, always calling, always asking about you, always wanting to know if I'd mentioned old times or old dresses. I couldn't risk her knowing what I'd planned. Everything I did to protect you, Sarah, and the truth. The dress you wore isn't just fabric, it's justice waiting to happen." The letter went on to explain what I'd already begun to piece together: how May had saved Rhapsody 12 the night Lillian Whitman died, how she'd kept it hidden for 53 years, adding the evidence to the hem decades later when she realized Elaine would never stop looking for it. But then May's writing became more urgent. The letters pressed harder into the paper. In March of last year, I went to the hospital. I'd been feeling weak, nauseated, confused. The doctors said it was just age, that I should expect these things at 84. But I've always been healthy, Natalie, and I knew something was wrong. I paid for additional blood work myself. Toxicology screening, the doctors said, was unnecessary. The results came back showing elevated arsenic levels in my blood. Attached to the letter with a paperclip were copies of lab results, the numbers circled in red ink. I didn't need medical training to understand what they meant. The arsenic levels were far above what could be explained by environmental exposure. May's diary was there too, a small leather-bound book I recognized from her bedside table at hospice. I'd thought it was just a journal of her final thoughts, something private I shouldn't read. Now I opened it and found entries that made my blood run cold. February 15th, 2021. Elaine visited today, brought homemade strawberry jam. Said she'd been thinking about old times, about Lillian and the dresses. Asked if I still had any of Lillian's work. I said no, everything was lost in the warehouse fire. She smiled, but her eyes were hard. April 3rd, 2021. Another visit. This time she brought baked goods and herbal tea, said it would help with my arthritis. I threw it away after she left. I'm not a fool. June 12th, 2021. Elaine called offering money for any textile artifacts from the 1970s. Started at $50,000, went up to $500,000. When I refused, her voice changed. You're playing a dangerous game for an old woman living alone, May. September 30th, 2021. Went to the police with my medical records. Detective Morrison said there wasn't enough evidence to investigate. Could be environmental exposure, he said. Old houses have lead and arsenic in the walls. I told him I've lived in the same house for 40 years and never had this problem before. He patted my hand like I was senile. November 8th, 2021. I know I'm dying. I know Elaine is killing me slowly and I can't prove it. So I've decided to make my death mean something. I've updated my will. The dress goes to Natalie. The insurance policy is in place. The trap is set. If I can't get justice for myself, at least I can make sure she gets it for me. I had to stop reading because I couldn't see through my tears. May had known. She'd known Elaine was poisoning her, and she'd documented it, and when no one would help her, she'd turned herself into bait for a trap that would only spring after she was gone. The final page of May's letter was shorter, written in an even shakier hand, as if she'd added it later when the poison had progressed further. I'm gambling on human nature, darling. I know Elaine will eventually hear you have the dress. I know she'll panic and try to destroy it. I'm counting on her to make a mistake, and I'm counting on you to be smart enough to let her. Trust Ruth Delgado. I sent her that anonymous letter years ago, and she's been waiting for this moment just as I have. Trust Gerald when he finally tells you the truth about being your father. He spent 39 years trying to protect you from afar. And remember, your mother died thinking she was guilty of something, but the real guilt belongs to Elaine. At the very bottom of the page, added in pencil, as if it were an afterthought, May had written one final message. P.S. Elaine didn't just kill me, sweetheart. Ask Gerald what really happened to your mother in 2015, and why he never came to her funeral. I left May's shop with her letter and diary clutched against my chest, feeling the weight of 50 years of secrets pressing down on me. Ruth had texted while I was there asking to meet at a coffee shop near the hotel, somewhere public but quiet, where we could talk without being overheard. I found her in a back corner booth, a worn accordion file sitting on the table beside her laptop, looking like she'd aged a decade since our meeting that morning. You found May's letter, she said when she saw my face. It wasn't a question. I slid into the booth across from her and placed the letter and diary on the table between us. She was murdered. Elaine poisoned her with arsenic over the course of more than a year, and when May tried to report it, the police dismissed her as a confused old woman. Ruth reached across and touched the diary gently as if it were something sacred. I know. May told me she was dying 6 months before it happened. She called me from a payphone, said she couldn't risk using her home phone or cell because Elaine might be monitoring them. We met at a rest stop halfway between here and Boston, and she told me everything about the poisoning, about the police refusing to investigate, about her plan to turn the dress into a trap. Ruth's voice was thick with emotion. I begged her to let me help her differently, to go to federal authorities, or to let me get her into protective custody, but she said no. She said, I'm 84 years old and dying anyway. Let my death accomplish something my life couldn't. I thought about May in those final months, knowing she was being slowly killed and choosing to use that knowledge as a weapon. How long have you known her? Ruth pulled the accordion file closer and opened it, revealing decades of accumulated papers organized with meticulous care. I first met May in 1998. I was a forensic accountant for the Massachusetts Attorney General's office, and I'd been assigned to review the Whitman Foundation case as part of a cold case initiative. The file was 27 years old at that point, and everyone involved assumed it would lead nowhere. But I'm stubborn, and I started making calls tracking down anyone who'd been connected to the foundation in the early 1970s. She pulled out a sheet of yellowed paper with phone numbers and names written in faded ink. May contacted me anonymously first, a letter mailed from 3 towns away. No return address, saying she had information about the embezzlement, but feared for her safety if she came forward officially. She gave me a phone number to call at a specific time from a specific payphone. It was like something from a spy novel, but when we finally met in person, I understood why she was so careful. Ruth showed me a photograph of May from 1998, younger, but still recognizably herself, standing in what looked like a parking lot beside Ruth, who appeared to be in her mid-30s. She told me she'd been the personal seamstress for the Whitman family in the early 1970s. She'd worked in their home, altered their clothes, created custom pieces for special occasions. She'd watched Lillian Whitman, Gerald's mother, grow increasingly desperate to document Elaine's theft. Lillian would come to May's shop and talk while May worked processing her fears out loud in a way she couldn't with her family. When Lillian died in that car accident, May was one of the first people to suspect it wasn't an accident at all. "Did May know Margaret Lane Whitman?" I asked, remembering the name from the documents the woman who'd supposedly died in the same accident. "May helped her escape," Ruth said quietly. The night of the accident, May received a phone call from someone she wouldn't name telling her to go to a specific location immediately. When she got there, she found a woman pulled from a burning car, injured but alive. May took her to a private doctor she trusted, and later helped arrange for the woman to leave the state with a new identity. May suspected it was Margaret, but she never confirmed it directly. She just knew that someone had tried to kill a woman who knew too much about the embezzlement. Ruth reached into the file and pulled out a small plastic case, the kind used for storing photographic negatives. Inside was a strip of microfilm, the images barely visible to the naked eye. In 1998, May gave me this as insurance. She'd photographed pages from several foundation ledgers before they were lost in an office fire in 1972. She'd done it at Lillian's request, sneaking into the foundation offices late at night with a camera. The ledgers showed systematic fund diversions totaling $2.8 million between January 1970 and March 1971. Every transaction had authorization signatures, but May witnessed at least 3 of those signatures being forged. She was in the office doing alterations on curtains when Elaine practiced Richard Whitman's signature over and over until she could replicate it perfectly. I stared at the microfilm case, understanding that I was looking at evidence May had risked her life to preserve. "You took this to your supervisors." "I did. I presented a comprehensive report documenting clear evidence of embezzlement, forgery, and potentially murder. I argued that the case should be reopened with full resources." Ruth's expression hardened. "I was told the case was too old, too politically sensitive. The Whitman family had connections to state senators, federal judges, major donors to both political parties. My supervisor literally said to me, 'Some rocks are better left unturned.' I was ordered to close the file and move on to other cases." "But you kept the evidence." "I kept everything May gave me. I made copies and stored them in multiple locations. And I made her a promise that someday when it was safe, when we had enough support and protection, we'd use this evidence to bring Elaine down." Ruth took a sip of her coffee, which had long since gone cold. "May told me, someday someone will be brave enough to stand in the light with this truth. We just have to keep it safe until then. I think she always knew that person would be you." "Why me?" I asked, though I thought I already knew the answer. Ruth looked at me with the steady gaze of someone delivering a truth that would change everything. "Your aunt wasn't just preserving evidence, Natalie. She was building a case across decades, waiting for the right moment and the right person. She chose you not because you're perfect or because you're fearless, but because you're Sarah and Gerald's daughter. You carry Lillian's blood through Gerald, and you carry Sarah's fierce loyalty to truth. May believed you'd be brave enough to see this through when others had failed." She told me then about May's final call 6 months before her death, when May said the plan was in motion and everything was ready. Ruth had visited May in hospice under a false name, posing as a distant cousin, and sat beside her bed while May whispered final instructions. "I will make sure your death means something," Ruth had promised. "I will make sure Elaine pays." Ruth reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a second plastic case containing another strip of microfilm. "May told me to give you this only after you'd read her letter. She said it would prove how your mother died, and it would make you understand why Gerald abandoned you both." I held the plastic case containing the second microfilm strip, afraid to open it, afraid of what truths had been preserved in those tiny photographs for nearly 40 years. Ruth must have seen the fear in my face because she reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "The library has a microfilm reader in the archives section," she said gently. "We can go now, or we can wait until you're ready. But Natalie, whatever is on this film, May wanted you to know. She believed you deserved the truth about your mother." We drove to the Brookfield Public Library, where I'd worked for 15 years, and the irony wasn't lost on me that I was about to discover the secrets of my own family's history in the same building where I'd helped countless patrons research theirs. The head archivist, an older woman named Helen, who'd always been kind to me, set us up in the private research room without asking questions, though I saw concern in her eyes when she looked at my face. Ruth loaded the microfilm into the reader with practiced efficiency, and suddenly the screen filled with documents I recognized: employment records from the Whitman Foundation, the letterhead familiar from the papers in Trevor's Rhapsody project file. She scrolled slowly, letting me read each page as it appeared. The first document was a job application dated September 1985 for Sarah Mitchell, my mother's maiden name. She'd applied for an administrative assistant position, and her qualifications were modest high school diploma, secretarial certificate from a community college, 3 years of experience in office management. At the bottom of the application, someone had written in blue ink, "Hired per G. Whitman recommendation, start date, October 1st, 1985. The next several pages were performance reviews spanning from 1985 to early 1987. Each one praised Sarah's attention to detail, her discretion with sensitive information, her initiative in organizing filing systems, and improving office efficiency. Gerald's signature appeared as the reviewing supervisor on most of them, and I could see in the comments a growing warmth and respect that went beyond professional evaluation. Sarah demonstrates exceptional capability, and Sarah has become invaluable to Foundation operations. And finally dated January 1987. Sarah Mitchell is the most competent and trustworthy member of our administrative team. But then came a document that made my breath catch: a handwritten memo on Elaine Whitman's personal stationery dated March 15, 1987, addressed to the Foundation's Board of Directors. It has come to my attention that Sarah Mitchell has been accessing financial records outside the scope of her position. Upon investigation, I've discovered unauthorized copying of confidential documents and suspicious activity in grant approval files. Given the sensitive nature of our work and the potential for legal liability, I recommend immediate termination. This matter should be handled with utmost discretion to protect the Foundation's reputation. Attached to the memo was a resignation letter dated April 3, 1987, signed by my mother in handwriting I recognized from birthday cards and grocery lists. I hereby resign my position at the Whitman Foundation effective immediately. I understand that I am bound by confidentiality agreements signed upon my employment, and I acknowledge that any breach of these agreements will result in criminal prosecution for theft of proprietary information and conspiracy to commit fraud. At the bottom, someone had added a notation in what I now recognized as May's distinctive script: forced signature under duress. Sarah pregnant, unmarried, terrified. Gerald powerless to protect her. Ruth's voice was quiet as she explained what May had told her about this period. Your mother and Gerald fell in love in 1986. He was serving on the Foundation board while his father Richard was still alive, and he was also married to Linda Trevor's mother. It was an impossible situation, but May said they were genuinely devoted to each other. When Sarah became pregnant with you in the spring of 1986, Gerald wanted to leave everything: his marriage, his position on the board, even his inheritance. He was prepared to walk away from the Whitman family entirely to be with her. But Elaine found out, I said, already knowing how this story would end. Elaine always found out everything. She had people watching Gerald, watching anyone who got close to the family's secrets. When she discovered Sarah was pregnant, she went to Gerald with an ultimatum. Ruth scrolled to another document, this one a typed letter with no signature dated March 1987. We have copies of fraudulent transfer authorizations with Sarah Mitchell's signature. We have testimony from 3 witnesses who will swear they saw her accessing restricted files. If you don't end this relationship immediately and completely, I will ensure Sarah is prosecuted for embezzlement. She will go to prison for 20 years, and your illegitimate child will be placed in foster care. You will never see either of them again. I felt sick reading those words, imagining my mother pregnant and terrified, imagining Gerald forced to choose between protecting us and destroying us. The documents were forgeries, I said. Elaine manufactured evidence to frame my mother. May believed so and so do I. But in 1987, Sarah had no resources to fight someone like Elaine Whitman. No money for lawyers, no powerful connections, and she was carrying the child of a married man from a prominent family. If Elaine had pressed charges even with fabricated evidence, Sarah would have been destroyed. Ruth's expression was pained. May helped orchestrate Sarah's escape. She gave her money, helped her change her name from Mitchell to Gordon, found her a place to live 3 states away. And she made Gerald promise he would never contact Sarah directly, but that he would ensure you were both always protected financially. Ruth scrolled to another document, and I saw my own birth certificate, a copy, not the original. Under father was written unknown, but in the margin in May's handwriting was a note, Gerald Whitman cannot be legally acknowledged. Financial support arranged through trust account. Child must never know until safe from Elaine. Gerald kept his promise, Ruth said. May's records show regular deposits into accounts she managed for your mother, not enough to raise suspicion, but enough to make sure you had food, shelter, educational opportunities. Every scholarship you thought you'd earned on merit, every grant that appeared at exactly the right moment, every lucky break your mother attributed to good fortune, Gerald arranged all of it from behind the scenes. I thought about my childhood, about how we'd always somehow managed, despite my mother's modest salary, about the way rent money appeared when we were short, about the anonymous donation that paid for my college textbooks. I'd thought we were just lucky. I'd thought my mother was just good at managing money. But it had been Gerald all along, a father I'd never known, protecting me the only way Elaine would allow. What about Vanessa? I asked, though I thought I knew the answer. Your mother met William Gordon in 1989, 2 years after you were born. He was kind but troubled, struggling with alcohol and depression. They married quickly, and Vanessa was born in 1992. William gave her his name, tried to be a father to both of you, but he couldn't manage his own demons. He left in 1997 and died in 2003. Ruth showed me May's notes from that period, observations about both girls growing up. Natalie carries the Whitman strength and intelligence. She's Gerald's daughter in every way. Vanessa carries Sarah's beauty and William's insecurity. Different fathers, same love, but the girls will never fully understand each other until they know the truth. Ruth scrolled to the final document on the microfilm, and my vision blurred with tears before I could even read it. It was a handwritten note on my mother's personal stationery dated April 2015, just weeks before she died. I can't live with the guilt anymore. Elaine was right, I did steal from the foundation. I deserve everything that happened. I was a thief and a liar, and I've spent 28 years running from what I did. My daughters deserve better than a mother who built their lives on stolen money and lies. Please tell Natalie and Vanessa I'm sorry. Tell them the truth about who I really was. I sat in the library archive room staring at my mother's suicide note, understanding with crushing clarity that Elaine had destroyed her even from beyond the grave. My mother had died believing she was a thief, believing she deserved the poverty and struggle of her life, believing her daughters had been raised on stolen money. Elaine had planted that lie so deeply that even 28 years later, it had driven my mother to take her own life. 3 days after Ruth's revelation, I received a certified letter. The return address showed only E. Whitman and a post office box in Boston. Inside was a single sheet of cream-colored stationery, heavy and expensive, with EW monogrammed at the top in elegant script. The handwriting was perfect, each letter formed with the precision of someone who'd learned penmanship in an era when such things mattered. Dear Natalie, it began, and I could hear the cold authority in every word. I understand you've been asking questions about events that occurred before you were born. I appreciate curiosity in young people, it speaks to an active mind. However, wisdom requires knowing when to stop asking questions that can only lead to pain. Your mother made poor choices in 1987, and she paid for them with a lifetime of guilt and shame. Her suicide in 2015 was tragic, but I'm afraid predictable. Some people simply cannot live with the weight of their own dishonesty. My hands shook as I continued reading. If you continue down this destructive path, I will be forced to release documentation proving that Sarah Gordon embezzled $340,000 from the Whitman Foundation between 1986 and 1987. I have transfer authorizations bearing her signature witness statements from Foundation employees and banking records that clearly show the theft. I've kept this information private out of respect for the dead, but I will not allow you to destroy a respected charitable organization based on the fantasies of a poisoned old seamstress and the delusions of a girl who never knew her real mother. The letter went on each sentence a carefully calibrated threat. I will also be forced to release evidence that your sister Vanessa has been complicit in insurance fraud deliberately damaging property for financial gain. And I'm afraid Trevor Whitman, despite being family, will face charges of criminal tax evasion for work he did on behalf of clients who sought to hide assets from federal authorities. Your entire family will be destroyed, Natalie. Your mother's memory will be tarnished. Your sister will go to prison. Trevor will lose his law license and his freedom. All because you couldn't leave well enough alone. But then came the offer. Alternatively, I'm prepared to purchase the damaged wedding dress from you for $3 million. A generous sum for a ruined garment, but I value family peace. Sell me the dress, sign a confidentiality agreement regarding any documents you may have found, and I will personally ensure that all pending legal matters disappear. Your sister's debts will be paid. Trevor's supposed crimes will be forgotten. Your mother's reputation will remain intact. You can move forward with your new marriage, your ordinary life, and forget about conspiracies that occurred before you were born. I trust you'll make the wise choice. Respectfully, E. Whitman. I read the letter 3 times, feeling the trap closing around me. Elaine had anticipated every move, prepared responses to every possible action. If I fought her, she'd destroy everyone I loved. If I capitulated, she'd win again as she'd been winning for 50 years. So I did something she didn't anticipate. I wrote the truth and made it public. That evening, I sat at my laptop and composed a long Facebook post. I didn't name Elaine or the Whitman Foundation or anyone specifically. Instead, I told a story about a wedding dress, about a sister who spilled wine under duress about a conspiracy 50 years old, and about an aunt who spent her final years being slowly poisoned while she documented evidence of crimes powerful people wanted buried. I wrote about women protecting each other across generations, about evidence hidden in plain sight, about the courage it takes to stand in the light when you've been told your entire life to stay in shadows. I ended with a question. How many of us carry secrets we were told to keep? How many of us protect people who hurt us because we're afraid of what they'll do if we speak? How many of us have been made to feel guilty for crimes we didn't commit? I hit post before I could second-guess myself, and within an hour, the responses started coming. Women I'd known from church, from the library, from my mother's old neighborhood, they shared the post and added their own stories. A woman whose small business had been destroyed by a powerful competitor who'd stolen her ideas. A teacher who'd been blackmailed into silence about abuse she'd witnessed. A nurse who'd reported financial irregularities at a hospital and lost her job. Dozens, then hundreds, then thousands of comments, each one a testimony to the ways powerful people silence those who threaten them. The Boston Globe called the next morning. A journalist named Miriam Chen had seen my post and wanted to know more about the Whitman Foundation, about May's death, about the dress, and what it represented. Within 48 hours, she'd published a feature article titled, "The Seamstress Who Stitched Justice: How One Woman's 50-Year Plan May Finally Expose Decades of Charity Fraud." The church community rallied. Older women who'd known May organized a gathering they called Truth and Testimony, inviting anyone who'd been silenced or threatened to come forward and share their stories publicly. Pastor Matthews offered the church hall, and more than 200 people showed up, many of them with their own experiences of being victimized by people in power. Ruth called me that evening, her voice carrying a note of satisfaction I hadn't heard before. "This is exactly what we needed. Elaine thrives in darkness and privacy, in back rooms and sealed court records and confidential settlements. The more public this becomes, the harder it is for her to use her usual tactics." She's dangerous, Natalie, and we can't underestimate her, but she's also calculating. She won't risk exposure by doing something obviously violent when everyone's watching. You've just made yourself too visible to quietly eliminate. I was beginning to believe we might actually win this when my phone rang late that night. Gerald's name appeared on the screen, and when I answered, I could hear the fear in his voice before he even spoke. Natalie, I just got a call from Elaine. She knows I'm your father. She knows everything about the DNA test form and my files, about the conversations I've had with Trevor and Ruth about the photograph of your mother and me. She says if I testify against her or help you in any way, she'll prove I forged my own father's signature in 1971 and send me to prison for the embezzlement instead of her. Gerald's fear was palpable through the phone, but I felt something shift inside me, a resolve that went deeper than my own story, deeper than family loyalty or personal revenge. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about every person Elaine had silenced over 50 years, every victim who'd been told to keep quiet, every truth that had been buried under threats and money and manufactured evidence. She can't send you to prison, Gerald, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Not when we have May's documentation showing you were 16 when those signatures were forged. Not when we have Ruth's testimony and the microfilm evidence. Elaine's bluffing because she's losing control. Over the next week, my inbox and voicemail filled with messages from people I'd never met. A woman named Patricia Breslin reached out through Facebook explaining that she'd worked at the Whitman Foundation in the early 1990s as a grants coordinator. Elaine told me to approve applications for organizations that didn't exist, Patricia wrote. She said it was a filing error, that the organizations were legitimate, but the paperwork was misplaced. When my daughter was diagnosed with leukemia, and I needed to take time off for her treatments, Elaine told me if I ever mentioned the filing errors to anyone, she'd make sure I lost my job and my health insurance. My daughter was 8 years old and fighting for her life. What choice did I have? A small business owner named Marcus Chen sent me a 10-page letter detailing how Elaine had destroyed his construction company in 2008. He'd been contracted to do renovation work on a community center funded by the Whitman Foundation, and when he refused to inflate his invoices so Elaine could collect kickbacks from the difference, she'd systematically ruined him, spreading rumors about shoddy workmanship, ensuring he failed safety inspections through bribed officials, and ultimately forcing him into bankruptcy. The most heartbreaking message came from an elderly woman named Dorothy Harrington, whose husband James had served on the foundation's board of directors in the 1980s. James found irregularities in the financial reports, she wrote. He tried to bring them to the other board members, but Elaine convinced them James was having a mental breakdown from work stress. 3 weeks later, he was found dead in his car in the garage, carbon monoxide poisoning. The police ruled it suicide, said he'd been depressed. But James wasn't depressed. He was angry and determined. I've spent 35 years knowing in my heart that my husband didn't kill himself, but I could never prove it. By the end of the week, more than 40 people had come forward with stories spanning 5 decades. Miriam Chen from the Boston Globe began verifying each account, cross-referencing dates and events, with public records, building a comprehensive timeline of Elaine's activities. When her investigative piece expanded into a multi-part series, the Massachusetts Attorney General's office took notice. A spokesperson confirmed they were opening a formal investigation into the Whitman Foundation's financial practices, examining both historical records and current operations. This changed everything. What had begun as a civil insurance dispute was now a potential criminal case involving fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy, and possibly manslaughter in May's death. Vanessa called me on a Tuesday afternoon, her voice small and uncertain. "Can we meet? Just the two of us? I need to talk to you about everything." We met at a quiet cafe near the library, and she arrived carrying a thick folder of printed documents. Her eyes were red from crying, but there was a determination in her face I'd rarely seen. "I've been reading the stories people are sharing," she said, sliding the folder across the table to me. I've been looking at what Elaine did to all those people, and I realized something. I was so focused on my own problems, my debt, my failing marriage, my desperate need to know who my father was, that I never thought about how many others she'd hurt the same way. I wasn't special. I wasn't even unusual. I was just another tool she picked up and used. The folder contained printed copies of every text message, email, and phone record documenting Elaine's manipulation. Vanessa had organized them chronologically, highlighting the threats and promises, creating a clear narrative of coercion and blackmail. "I need to make this right," she said, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I need to testify about what she made me do, not to save myself, but because if I don't, she'll do this to someone else. There will always be another desperate person she can manipulate, another family she can destroy." I reached across the table and took my sister's hands. "You were a victim too, Vanessa. She found your weakness and exploited it. That's what predators do. But now we get to choose to be survivors instead of victims. We get to stand up together." We sat there crying and talking for 2 hours, rebuilding bridges that had been burned, understanding each other in ways we never had before. Vanessa told me about the years of comparing herself to me, about the exhausting performance of her influencer life, about the crushing weight of debt and shame. I told her about the loneliness of always being the responsible one, about discovering our different fathers, about learning that Gerald had been protecting me from shadows my entire life. As we were preparing to leave, my laptop pinged with a Google alert I'd set up for news about the Whitman Foundation. The headline made my blood run cold. "Former Whitman Foundation board member found dead in apparent suicide, authorities investigating potential foul play." The news article identified the dead man as Robert Castellano, a board member who'd served on the Whitman Foundation from 2018 to 2023 before retiring. Police were investigating after his wife reported finding inconsistencies in his supposed suicide note. I felt the ground shifting beneath me again, understanding that Elaine was escalating, that people were dying, and that anyone who threatened her secrets was in danger. Gerald called the next morning and asked me to meet him at a diner 40 minutes outside town, somewhere neutral where we wouldn't be recognized. When I arrived, I found him sitting in a back booth, looking older and more fragile than I'd ever seen him. On the table between us was a manila envelope unsealed, and I could see the edge of official-looking documents inside. "I had your DNA tested," he said without preamble, pushing the envelope toward me. "I obtained a sample from a coffee cup you used at the reception. I know it was an invasion of privacy, but I needed scientific proof before I told you everything, before I asked you to believe something that will change your understanding of your entire life." I opened the envelope and pulled out the laboratory report. The technical language was dense, but the conclusion was clear: probability of paternity 99.97%. Gerald Whitman was my biological father, confirmed by science, undeniable and absolute. "I fell in love with your mother in 1986. Gerald said, his voice thick with emotion held back for decades. Sarah joined the foundation staff that spring, hired as an administrative assistant. I was on the board while my father Richard was still alive, and I was married to Linda Trevor's mother. I knew falling in love with Sarah was wrong, impossible, dangerous, but I couldn't help it. She was brilliant and kind, and she saw through all the pretension and performance my family required. She saw me, the real me, and she loved that person." He told me about stolen afternoons at May's shop, where Sarah would go for dress fittings, and he would meet her, about careful phone calls from payphones, about the impossible dream they shared of building a life together. When she told me she was pregnant in November 1986, I was terrified and overjoyed in equal measure. I wanted to leave everything: my marriage, my position at the foundation, even my inheritance. I was prepared to walk away from the Whitman name entirely to be with her and raise you. "But Elaine found out," I said. "Elaine always finds out. She had me followed, my phone tapped, my mail intercepted. When she confirmed Sarah was pregnant, she came to me with an ultimatum and evidence I couldn't refute. She showed me bank statements with Sarah's forged signatures authorizing transfers of foundation money to offshore accounts. She had fabricated emails discussing the theft, fake testimony from people she'd paid or blackmailed into lying. She told me if I didn't disappear from Sarah's life completely, she'd have Sarah arrested and prosecuted. 20 years in federal prison for embezzlement and fraud, and my unborn child placed in foster care. Gerald's hands trembled as he spoke. May convinced me the only way to protect you both was to let you go. Sarah would take a new name move away, build a life where Elaine couldn't touch her, and I would stay behind, trapped in my family's web, but I'd make sure you were always protected financially. Anonymous scholarships, mystery grants, lucky breaks that weren't luck at all. I've been watching over you for 38 years. Natalie, from a distance I hated but couldn't cross. He told me about attending my high school graduation from the back of the auditorium in disguise, about seeing my wedding announcement in the newspaper, and crying in his study about the photographs May sent him over the years that he kept in a locked box in his desk. When your mother died in 2015, I wanted desperately to attend her funeral, to finally acknowledge you as my daughter, to tell you everything. But Elaine threatened to release all the fabricated evidence against Sarah's memory if I made contact. She said she'd destroy your mother's reputation posthumously, make you believe she really was a thief. I can testify now, Gerald said, and I heard steel beneath the emotion. I've been collecting evidence against Elaine for years, documents, recordings, testimony from others she's victimized. I'm ready to stand in court and tell the truth, even if it means going to prison. Even if Elaine succeeds in framing me for the forgeries I was forced to sign as a teenager. I need to do this, Natalie. I need to finally be the father I should have been all along. We left the diner together, walking to the parking garage where I'd left my car. Gerald was still talking, telling me about the evidence he'd gathered, when two men emerged from between parked cars. They wore dark clothing and moved with practiced aggression, and I understood what was happening half a second before it began. One grabbed Gerald from behind, locking an arm around his throat. The other stepped toward me, demanding my phone and laptop in a voice that suggested he'd done this before. Gerald struggled, trying to break free, trying to protect me, and the man holding him struck him hard across the face with something metal. Gerald fell, his head hitting the concrete with a sickening sound, and I heard myself screaming. I fought with a ferocity I didn't know I possessed, using my keys as a weapon, my nails, my voice. The sound of other cars entering the garage startled the attackers, and they fled, running toward the stairwell and disappearing. I dropped to my knees beside Gerald, who was conscious but bleeding from a gash above his eye where his head had struck the ground. "Call 911, he managed to say, blood running down his face. "But Natalie, listen. Elaine knows I talked to you. This is her warning. This is what she does to people who threaten her. But I'm not backing down. I'm going to testify even if she kills me for it." The ambulance arrived within minutes. At the hospital, while doctors treated Gerald's concussion and stitched the wound on his head, my phone buzzed with an incoming message from an unknown number. I opened it and felt my stomach turn. The photo showed May in her hospice bed, taken during her final days, looking frail and barely conscious. Below the image was a message: "Your aunt's death was just practice. Back off now, or there will be more funerals." I showed the threatening photo to Detective Kim when she arrived at the hospital to take our statements about the parking garage attack. She was a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who'd been assigned to investigate Robert Castellano's suspicious death. And when she saw the image of May with that chilling message, her expression hardened. "This is a direct threat, and combined with your aunt's diary and the medical records you've shown me, I think we have grounds to request toxicology testing on preserved blood samples." Ruth and I filed a formal petition with Mercy General Hospital the next morning, requesting access to any biological samples preserved from May's March 2021 hospitalization. Massachusetts law permits such requests when there's credible evidence a crime may have been committed, and with the Attorney General's office now formally involved in investigating the Whitman Foundation. Our petition received immediate support. The hospital's medical records department confirmed they had stored blood samples from 3 separate dates during May's treatment in 2021, standard protocol for patients presenting with unusual symptoms that might require future analysis. The samples were sent to an independent forensic laboratory in Boston, and Ruth hired a toxicologist named Dr. Michael Torres to oversee the testing. When the results came back 10 days later, Dr. Torres called us to his office to review the findings in person. He spread 3 laboratory reports across his desk, each one corresponding to a different collection date, and I could see the numbers climbing even before he explained what they meant. January 15, 2021. Dr. Torres began pointing to the first report. Arsenic level 0.8 micrograms per liter. That's elevated. Normal background exposure is typically below 0.3, but not immediately alarming. Could potentially be attributed to environmental factors or dietary sources, though it's on the high end of that explanation. He moved to the second report. June 23, 2021. Arsenic level 2.1 micrograms per liter. Now we're in concerning territory. This level indicates ongoing exposure from a source that's not environmental or dietary in the normal sense. He tapped the third report, and I saw the number that confirmed everything May had suspected, 4.3 mcg/L. November 8, 2021. Arsenic level 4.3 micrograms per liter. This is dangerously high and indicates chronic poisoning over an extended period. The progression across these 3 samples tells a clear story. Your aunt was being systematically poisoned with small repeated doses over approximately 18 months, maybe longer. Ruth pulled out May's diary and laid it beside the toxicology reports. Can you correlate the elevated levels with specific events or exposures? Dr. Torres spent the next hour reviewing May's meticulous documentation. She'd recorded every visitor, every gift received, every meal eaten, every symptom experienced. When we cross-referenced her entries with the blood sample dates, a pattern emerged that made my hands shake. Elaine Whitman had visited May's home 12 times between January 2020 and December 2021. Each visit was noted in May's diary with increasing suspicion. EW brought strawberry jam, threw it away after she left. EW brought tea and cookies, felt ill 3 hours later. EW insists I try her special blend of herbs for arthritis, disposed of it immediately. This is one of the clearest cases of deliberate poisoning I've encountered in 20 years of forensic toxicology, Dr. Torres stated for the official record. The perpetrator was patient calculating and counting on the victim's death being attributed to natural age-related decline. Arsenic poisoning in elderly patients often presents with symptoms that mimic common conditions: fatigue, confusion, weakness, nausea. Medical professionals who aren't specifically looking for toxins frequently miss it. Detective Kim took possession of Dr. Torres's report and May's diary along with all the documentation we'd compiled. 2 days later, she called to inform us that the district attorney's office was opening a homicide investigation into May Gordon's death. This changes everything, she explained when we met at the DA's office. What started as insurance fraud and historical embezzlement is now a murder case. We get more resources, more urgency, and more legal tools. Murder doesn't have a statute of limitations. I sat across from Detective Kim and the assistant district attorney, a serious woman named Jennifer Alvarez, and gave my statement. My aunt spent her last months being slowly poisoned by a woman she was trying to expose. She documented everything: her symptoms, her suspicions, her evidence. She knew she was dying, but instead of trying to save herself, she used her death as part of a plan to trap her killer. She turned herself into bait because she knew no one would listen to an old woman's accusations. But a murder investigation that would force people to look at the evidence she'd preserved. I won't let that sacrifice be meaningless. The investigation moved rapidly after that. Detective Kim interviewed everyone who'd had contact with May in her final years: neighbors, former clients, healthcare workers, delivery people. She obtained May's phone records and identified every call from Elaine Whitman. She requested security footage from the pharmacy where May filled prescriptions looking for anyone suspicious. She built a timeline that showed Elaine's escalating desperation as May refused to sell the dress or reveal its location. 3 weeks after the homicide investigation opened, Detective Kim called me to meet her at a coffee shop rather than the police station. When I arrived, I could see tension in her shoulders, the way she kept glancing at the door as if worried about being followed. "We're building a warrant to search Elaine Whitman's home," she said quietly, leaning across the table. "We have probable cause based on the toxicology evidence, May's diary, and witness testimony. But here's the problem. Someone inside the police department has been feeding Elaine information. I don't know who, but I know it's happening because she's always one step ahead of us. We think she's been tipped off about the warrant. We think she's preparing to run." The knowledge that Elaine was preparing to flee filled me with a desperate urgency, but there was one more conversation I needed to have before the final confrontation. I called Vanessa and asked her to meet me at my apartment. And when she arrived, I could see she'd been crying again. Her eyes red and swollen, her usual polished appearance replaced by raw vulnerability. "I need to tell you something about our family," I said, gesturing for her to sit on the couch beside me. "About our parents, about why we're different." I told her everything Ruth had revealed about Gerald and our mother's love affair, about Elaine's ultimatum, and the manufactured evidence about May orchestrating Sarah's escape, and Gerald's 38 years of secret protection. I told her about the DNA test confirming Gerald as my biological father, and then I told her about William Gordon, the troubled man who'd married our mother in 1989 and given Vanessa his name before his demons drove him away. Vanessa listened in silence, her face cycling through shock pain, and finally a resignation that looked like old grief being acknowledged for the first time. When I finished, she sat quietly for a long moment before speaking. "So even in this, you're special. You're connected to this important wealthy family with all their history and drama and power, and I'm just nobody's daughter. The child of a man so broken he couldn't even stay around to watch me grow up." I took both her hands in mine, holding them firmly when she tried to pull away. "Listen to me, Vanessa. We're sisters because Mom loved us both with everything she had. We're sisters because we grew up in the same tiny apartment, splitting the last bowl of cereal and sharing a bedroom and protecting each other from bullies at school. We're sisters because we choose each other. Blood doesn't make family love, and loyalty do. And right now you're showing more loyalty than any blood relative ever has. You came forward with evidence that could send you to prison. You've been honest about your mistakes when you could have run away. That's who you are. Not William Gordon's insecure daughter, but Sarah Gordon's brave one." Vanessa broke down, then crying against my shoulder the way she used to when we were children, and the world felt too big and frightening. When she finally pulled away, wiping her face with her sleeve, there was something different in her expression, a kind of determined clarity I'd never seen before. "I need to do something," she said. "Something public. Something that makes it impossible for Elaine to intimidate me into silence ever again." She pulled out her phone and opened her social media accounts where her carefully curated life as a lifestyle influencer had been frozen since the wedding. "I have 180,000 followers. People who think they know me because they see my posts about fashion and travel and the perfect life I pretended to have. It's time they knew the truth." Over the next 2 hours, Vanessa recorded a 20-minute video confession. She set up her phone on a tripod in my living room, fixed her hair and makeup one last time out of habit, and then spoke directly to the camera with an honesty that was almost painful to witness. She admitted to deliberately spilling wine on my dress, explained exactly how Elaine Whitman had manipulated her through threats against Trevor and promises about her father's identity, and showed screenshots of the threatening texts that had controlled her for weeks. She apologized to me, to our wedding guests, and to everyone who'd been hurt by her participation in Elaine's schemes. "I thought I was protecting my family by obeying someone powerful," she said, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. "Instead, I was helping a criminal silence the truth. I was letting myself be used as a weapon against people I loved. I'm done being afraid of what Elaine Whitman might do to me. I'm ready to testify about everything she made me do, no matter what it costs me. And if there are others out there who've been manipulated the same way, if there are people reading this who know what it's like to be threatened and controlled and forced to hurt someone because you were too scared to refuse, I want you to know you're not alone. We can stand together." She posted the video to her Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok accounts with the caption, The truth about my sister's wedding and about the woman who's been destroying lives for 50 years. And the hashtag, Stitched in Truth. Within an hour, the video had 10,000 views. Within 6 hours, it had passed 100,000. By the next morning, it had been viewed over 2 million times. The comment section exploded with responses. Thousands of women shared their own stories of being manipulated, threatened, or silenced by powerful people. But more significantly, several women came forward with specific claims about Elaine Whitman. A former employee at a cosmetics company described being paid to sabotage a rival's product launch by planting false reports about contamination. A paralegal admitted to planting fabricated evidence in a divorce case at Elaine's instruction. A nurse confessed to providing false testimony in a malpractice lawsuit coerced by threats against her nursing license. The collective portrait that emerged was devastating Elaine Whitman as a serial manipulator who'd spent decades finding vulnerable people and weaponizing them against her enemies, always keeping her own hands clean, always maintaining plausible deniability. Vanessa called me the morning after her video posted, and I could hear the fear beneath her brave tone. "Natalie, something came to my door this morning. A package with no return address." Her voice shook. Inside was a piece of white fabric like silk, or maybe satin, and it's stained with something dark red that looks like blood. There was a note. It said, "You and your sister will wear matching shrouds before this is over." The bloody fabric and threatening note made one thing clear. Elaine was desperate, and desperate people make fatal mistakes. Detective Kim arranged for protective details on both Vanessa and me, but she also said something that gave me hope. "She's losing control. The more public this gets, the more she lashes out, the more evidence she creates. We just need to survive long enough to catch her in the act." The Whitman Foundation Board called an emergency meeting 3 days later to address what they carefully termed recent allegations and media attention affecting the foundation's reputation. As Gerald's daughter and a direct party to the insurance investigation, I was invited to present my concerns formally. The meeting would take place in the foundation's headquarters, a beautiful old building in downtown Boston, with mahogany paneling and oil paintings of past board members lining the walls. I arrived with Ruth Daniel and a lawyer named Catherine Ross, whom the Attorney General's office had recommended. The boardroom was exactly what I'd imagined, a long, polished table surrounded by leather chairs, windows overlooking the harbor, an air of old money and older secrets. 12 board members sat around the table, most of them elderly, all of them looking uncomfortable. Foundation attorneys occupied seats along the wall, their expressions carefully neutral. Trevor sat near the middle, looking like he hadn't slept in days. Gerald sat to his left, still bearing visible injuries from the parking garage attack, bruises yellowing on his face, a white bandage above his eye, his arm in a sling. And at the head of the table sat Elaine Whitman. She was 75 years old, but could have passed for 60 with perfect posture and silver hair styled in an elegant chignon. She wore a navy suit that probably cost more than I made in 3 months, and when she looked at me, her eyes were cold and assessing, showing no fear whatsoever. She'd been destroying people for 50 years. What was one more young woman with delusions of justice, Ms. Gordon? She said, her voice carrying the cultured tones of someone who'd never had to raise it to be heard. "I appreciate you accepting our invitation to address these unfortunate allegations. Before we begin, I want to assure everyone in this room that the Whitman Foundation has operated with integrity for over 70 years. What we're witnessing is an unfortunate family dispute being exploited by an attention-seeking young woman with a vendetta. The documents she claims to have are forgeries. The accusations of poisoning are paranoid delusions. The current investigation is a waste of taxpayer resources that will ultimately vindicate this foundation completely." Ruth stood and connected her laptop to the projector. "Let's present the evidence and let the board decide." For the next 40 minutes, we methodically destroyed Elaine's defenses. Ruth displayed the 1971 embezzlement document found in my dress's hem, along with the forensic analysis confirming the paper ink and signatures were authentic to that period. She showed the microfilm of foundation ledgers documenting systematic fraud totaling $2.8 million. She presented May's medical records and toxicology reports with Dr. Torres's testimony that the arsenic poisoning was deliberate and sustained. We played excerpts from Vanessa's video confession and showed the threatening text messages Elaine had sent. Ruth presented written testimony from 43 additional victims, each one documenting manipulation threats or financial crimes committed by or at the direction of Elaine Whitman. The final piece was a financial analysis conducted by forensic accountants at the Attorney General's office. Over 50 years, approximately $12 million had been diverted from the foundation through shell companies' fake grants and offshore accounts. The money had been used to purchase real estate in Elaine's name fund, her lifestyle, and pay off people she wanted to control. When Ruth finished, the room was silent. Several board members looked physically ill. The foundation attorneys were frantically taking notes, already calculating liability and damage control. Elaine sat perfectly still, her expression unchanged, as if she were listening to a weather report rather than a comprehensive indictment of her life's work. Then Gerald stood. He moved slowly, pain visible in every gesture, but he stood and looked directly at Elaine as he spoke. Elaine Whitman has controlled this family through fear for 53 years. She killed my mother in 1971 to cover her initial crimes. I know this because my mother told me she was afraid. Told me Elaine had threatened her, and 3 days later she was dead. Elaine forced me to abandon the woman I loved and the daughter I desperately wanted to raise by threatening to frame Sarah for embezzlement and put my unborn child in foster care. She systematically stole from a charity meant to help vulnerable people, students who needed scholarships, communities that needed support, families that needed hope. She murdered May Gordon with poison when May refused to surrender the evidence sewn into that dress. And 3 days ago, she hired people to assault me in a parking garage when I decided to tell the truth. Gerald's voice broke, but he continued. I signed documents she told me to sign when I was 16 years old, too young to understand what I was doing, too frightened to refuse. I've been her prisoner ever since. But today, I choose my daughter over my fear. Today, I choose truth over survival, and I'm prepared to testify to all of this in any court in this country. Elaine remained eerily calm throughout Gerald's testimony. When he finished and sat down heavily, she stood gracefully, smoothed her suit jacket, and smiled. The smile didn't reach her eyes, and there was something in it that made my skin crawl, not fear or anger, but a kind of cold amusement. How theatrical, she said, her voice still perfectly controlled. Gerald always did have a flair for drama. Unfortunately, none of you will live to see any charges filed. She picked up her purse, nodded to the board members as if she'd just concluded a routine meeting, and walked calmly toward the door. The foundation attorneys scrambled to their feet, one of them pulling out his phone to call the police, another shouting for Elaine to stop, but she simply opened the door and disappeared into the hallway beyond. Security rushed into the boardroom within minutes of Elaine's departure, but she'd already left the building. Detective Kim arrived 20 minutes later, furious that Elaine had walked out of what should have been a controlled environment, but she assured us that officers were searching for her, and that she wouldn't get far. I wanted to believe her, but I'd watched Elaine operate for weeks now, and I knew she was always several moves ahead. 24 hours later, the news broke. A housekeeper had found Elaine Whitman dead in her suite at the Fairmont Copley Plaza, an apparent suicide. The police held a brief press conference confirming they'd found sleeping pills and a handwritten note expressing remorse for unspecified actions. Vanessa called me sobbing, conflicted between relief and guilt. Trevor sounded hollow when he phoned to say he didn't know how to feel. Gerald's reaction was the most complicated I could hear in his voice, that he was both relieved his tormentor was gone and haunted that she'd escaped justice. Then my phone buzzed with a text from Ruth. Don't believe it. Check your phone in 10 minutes. When I called her exactly 10 minutes later, Ruth's voice carried a satisfaction I'd never heard before. This is exactly what we expected. Elaine is too narcissistic and too calculating to actually kill herself. We've been planning this endgame with the FBI for the past week, and she's doing exactly what we knew she would. Ruth explained that for the past 10 days, since the toxicology evidence had proven May's murder, the FBI had been monitoring Elaine under a sealed federal warrant. They'd tracked her communications, her financial transactions, her movements, And they'd discovered something remarkable. Elaine had been preparing an escape plan for years, probably decades. She had a complete alternate identity as Helen Price, supposedly a Canadian citizen with a passport, driver's license, and full documentation. She had offshore accounts in Switzerland containing over $8 million. She'd purchased a villa in Geneva under a shell corporation, and she had airline tickets for a route carefully designed to avoid extradition treaties. FBI Special Agent Marcus Torres made a strategic decision, Ruth said. Rather than arrest her at the board meeting and let her hire expensive lawyers who'd dragged this through courts for years, he decided to let her fake her death and attempt to flee. The staged suicide, the flight to avoid prosecution, it provides overwhelming evidence of consciousness of guilt. No defense attorney can explain that away. Ruth and Natalie had been brought into the plan 3 days ago, sworn to secrecy, and asked to proceed with the board meeting presentation as if they didn't know what was coming next. "We needed Elaine to feel cornered," Ruth explained. "We needed her desperate enough to activate her escape plan." At 7 o'clock that evening, I stood near the security checkpoint at JFK International Airport's Terminal 4, positioned where I could see but not be immediately visible. Ruth stood beside me, and Special Agent Torres was nearby, speaking quietly into a radio. We watched Elaine approach the Swiss Air check-in counter, and I almost didn't recognize her. She'd dyed her hair a dark brown, wore plain reading glasses, and dressed in unremarkable travel clothes, jeans, a simple sweater, running shoes. She looked like any middle-aged tourist heading home after a vacation. She handed her passport to the ticket agent, and I saw the name on her boarding pass, Helen Price, first class to Zurich, departing at 9:30. The agent processed her ticket, handed back her passport, and that's when federal agents emerged from every direction. At least a dozen of them, moving with coordinated precision, surrounding Elaine so completely that escape was impossible. Special Agent Torres stepped forward, his voice carrying authority that silenced the entire check-in area. "Elaine Porter Whitman, you're under arrest for murder, conspiracy to commit fraud, embezzlement, witness tampering, and flight to avoid prosecution." Elaine's carefully maintained composure shattered. Her head whipped around, looking for exit routes that didn't exist, for help that wouldn't come. She saw the agents closing in, saw the other travelers backing away, saw the reality that her 50-year reign of control was ending in the most public, humiliating way possible. Then she saw me. Our eyes locked across the terminal, and for just a moment I saw everything in her expression: rage, fear, and a hatred so pure it was almost physical. As the agents moved to handcuff her, she hissed loud enough for me to hear, "You think you've won? There's one more secret sewn into that dress, and when it comes out, it will destroy everything you think you know about your precious aunt." Elaine's final words haunted me as federal agents led her away in handcuffs, but I pushed them aside to focus on what came next. The legal machinery moved with surprising speed once it engaged. Within days of her arrest, prosecutors had filed formal charges: first-degree murder in May Gordon's death, with evidence of premeditation through the systematic poisoning documented in medical records and May's diary. Multiple counts of embezzlement and fraud, spanning 5 decades, each one meticulously documented through Ruth's microfilm evidence and forensic accounting. Conspiracy, witness tampering, and attempted flight to avoid prosecution proven by her fake suicide and the Helen Price identity. Elaine's attorneys tried to negotiate a plea deal offering cooperation in exchange for reduced charges, but District Attorney Jennifer Alvarez refused to bargain. "This case is too important," she told me during one of our preparation meetings. "Too many victims, too much evidence, too much public interest. Elaine Whitman is going to face every single charge in open court." The trial lasted only 3 weeks. The evidence was so overwhelming that Elaine's defense crumbled under cross-examination. 43 victims testified. Ruth presented the financial analysis. Dr. Torres explained the arsenic poisoning in terms any jury could understand. Gerald took the stand and told the complete story of 50 years under Elaine's control. When the verdict came back guilty on all counts, I felt something release in my chest that I hadn't known I'd been holding. The judge sentenced Elaine to 35 years in federal prison without possibility of parole. At 75 years old, it was effectively a life sentence. Additional civil suits from the reconstituted Foundation Board and individual victims resulted in the forfeiture of all her assets, the villa in Geneva, the offshore accounts, even her personal jewelry collection. Everything would be liquidated to provide restitution to the people she'd harmed. Gerald's situation required more delicate handling. He had signed documents at 16 that contributed to the original embezzlement, even though he'd done so under duress and manipulation. Prosecutors spent weeks reviewing his case before determining that charging him would serve no purpose. He'd been a minor under coercion and had lived as a victim of ongoing blackmail for 50 years. Instead, they offered him immunity in exchange for his continued cooperation with ongoing investigations into the Foundation's operations. He formally acknowledged me as his daughter through DNA testing submitted to the court, and we filed a petition to amend my birth certificate. The judge approved adding Gerald's name to the document while keeping Gordon as my surname, a compromise that honored both my biological father and the mother who'd raised me. Gerald also established the May Gordon Memorial Foundation, funding it with $5 million of his own money. The foundation's mission was to support women over 50 who were returning to the workforce or starting new careers after life disruptions, exactly the kind of practical, meaningful help May would have appreciated. Vanessa closed all her lifestyle influencer accounts the week after Elaine's sentencing. She told me she couldn't look at those carefully curated photos of a perfect life that had never existed, couldn't pretend anymore that success meant having strangers admire your aesthetic. Instead, she started a new platform focused on authentic storytelling about manipulation, debt, and recovery. Her first post was titled, "How I Let Someone Turn Me Into a Weapon Against My Sister," and it received 500,000 views in the first day. The audience she attracted was smaller but more engaged women who'd experienced similar manipulation, who understood the psychology of coercion, who were trying to rebuild their lives after escaping controlling relationships. She and Trevor started couples therapy, working through the trauma of realizing they'd been controlled and manipulated for years of their marriage. Trevor had to confront his own passivity, his willingness to look away from things he knew were wrong because confrontation frightened him. It was painful work, but I could see them both changing, becoming more honest with each other and themselves. Vanessa and I began having weekly dinners, just the two of us talking about our mother in ways we never had before. We pieced together her life from fragments: May's letters, Gerald's memories, our own childhood recollections. We realized how much Sarah had sacrificed, how much she'd carried alone, how much strength it had taken to build a life from nothing, after Elaine had destroyed everything she'd known. "I spent my whole life feeling like I was in your shadow," Vanessa told me one evening over takeout Chinese food in my apartment. "Resenting you for being smarter, more responsible, more capable. But now I understand we were both in the dark together, both trying to make sense of a story we didn't know we were part of. Now we're finally stepping into light." 3 weeks after Elaine's sentencing, I received a formal letter from the New England Museum of Textile Arts. The director, a woman named Dr. Catherine Whitmore, wrote that they were honored to request the donation of Rhapsody 12 for permanent exhibition as a historically significant artifact. The letter was professional and enthusiastic, but one paragraph made my heart skip. "Our textile analysis team has been conducting preliminary examinations of photographs of the dress, and they've noticed unusual stitching along the interior label that wasn't visible in previous examinations or in the forensic reports compiled during the investigation. The pattern appears to be recent, possibly added in the last few years. We'd like your permission to investigate this further before proceeding with public display." The museum's letter about unusual stitching on the interior label troubled me, but I decided to address it after the May Gordon Memorial Gala, which was scheduled for 6 weeks after Elaine's sentencing. Gerald had worked with the museum to organize the event, and it had grown beyond anything I'd imagined. Over 300 people confirmed attendance, requiring the museum to open their entire textile wing for the evening. The Rhapsody 12 dress hung in a climate-controlled glass case at the center of the exhibit, dramatically lit, so the ivory silk seemed to glow. The wine stain was still visible across the bodice, but the museum had chosen not to restore it. "The damage is part of the story," Dr. Whitmore explained. "It represents the moment truth was activated, the moment this dress transformed from hidden evidence into public testimony." The exhibit surrounding the dress told May's story through photographs, documents, and recorded testimony. Visitors could read excerpts from May's diary, see the toxicology reports that proved her murder view, the 1971 embezzlement documents that had been hidden in the hem, and listen to audio recordings of the 43 victims who'd testified against Elaine. The museum had also created an interactive element, a digital archive where visitors could submit their own stories of speaking truth to power, creating a living collection of courage that would grow over time. I gave a speech that evening to the assembled guests standing near the dress that had changed everything. My Aunt May was a seamstress who worked in a small shop most people walked past without noticing. She didn't have wealth or power or influence in the traditional sense. What she had was patience, skill, and an absolute commitment to truth. She spent over 50 years protecting evidence that powerful people wanted destroyed. She endured threats, intimidation, and ultimately murder, but she never wavered. She turned herself into bait for a trap that would only spring after her death because she believed that justice was worth her life. This dress represents more than beautiful craftsmanship or historical significance. It represents what happens when women protect and believe each other across generations, when we refuse to let truth be buried no matter how powerful the people trying to bury it. The exhibit became the museum's most visited ever, with women traveling from across the country to see the dress and add their own stories to the growing archive. Many of them were older women who'd spent decades carrying secrets they'd been told to keep, and May's courage gave them permission to finally speak. As the gala wound down near 10 o'clock, I stood near the dress watching the last guests filter out, feeling exhausted but satisfied. That's when I noticed an elderly woman approaching slowly, leaning heavily on an elegant wooden cane. She was perhaps 88 or 90 years old, dressed in simple but expensive clothing, a dove-gray suit that spoke of old money and good taste. She stood before the glass case for a long time, tears streaming down her weathered face, one hand pressed against her chest as if her heart hurt. I approached quietly, not wanting to intrude on what felt like a private moment of grief or memory. But she must have sensed my presence because she turned to me with eyes that were still sharp despite her age. "I wore this dress first, you know," she said, her voice cultured and steady despite the tears. 54 years ago at the gala where everything began. I stood in front of 500 people wearing this exact dress, trying to smile, while knowing that the woman who'd commissioned it was stealing from the charity we were supposed to be celebrating. She reached out as if she wanted to touch the glass, then pulled her hand back. "My name is Margaret Lane Whitman, and I've been waiting a very long time to see this dress again, and to meet the young woman brave enough to finish what I started." I stared at her, my mind racing through everything I knew about the 1971 scandal. Margaret Lane Whitman, the woman who supposedly died in a car accident, the woman May had helped escape, the woman whose disappearance had ended the original investigation. She was alive. She'd been alive this whole time. Margaret touched the glass case protecting the dress and whispered, "There's something you need to know about your Aunt May, about your father, and about the night I disappeared, because this story didn't begin in 1971. It began in 1970 with a second dress that May never finished." I gestured for Margaret to sit on a bench near the exhibit, my legs suddenly unsteady. The museum had closed for the evening, but Dr. Whitmore discreetly ensured we had privacy, stationing herself at a distance, where she could provide security but not eavesdrop. Margaret settled onto the bench with the careful movements of someone whose body had endured decades, but whose mind remained sharp. "I was Richard Whitman's first wife," she began, her voice carrying the weight of a story held silent for 54 years. "Gerald's mother. In 1970, I was 34 years old, a board member of the Whitman Foundation, and deeply involved in our charitable work. I commissioned my husband's cousin, Lillian Whitman, to design the Rhapsody collection for our annual gala, 12 dresses, each one a work of art. Lillian was talented but troubled, struggling with her own suspicions about financial irregularities at the foundation. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she continued. Richard had recently married again after being widowed Elaine Porter, this beautiful 20-year-old woman who seemed devoted to charitable work. I tried to welcome her to help her understand the Foundation's mission. But during the planning for the gala, I discovered inconsistencies in the grant applications. Organizations that didn't exist. Transfer authorizations with signatures that looked like Richard's but weren't quite right. I started investigating quietly, and what I found terrified me. She described confronting Elaine in February 1971, showing her the evidence, offering her a chance to return the money and resign quietly. Elaine looked at me with eyes that held no warmth, no remorse, nothing human. She said, "I've worked too hard to get into this family. If you expose me, I'll kill you and make it look like an accident, and then I'll make sure your son goes to prison for the theft instead." I didn't believe her at first. How could someone so young be so calculating, so evil? Margaret went to the police, but they dismissed her concerns. Elaine had already begun planting stories about Margaret's supposed mental instability, about the stress of losing Richard's first wife and struggling to accept the new marriage. 2 weeks later, on a rainy March evening, Margaret was driving home from visiting May's shop when a car forced her off a cliff road. "May saved my life," Margaret said, tears flowing freely now. "I'd told her I was afraid, and she insisted on following me that night. She saw the other car deliberately sideswipe mine, watched my vehicle go over the edge. She climbed down that cliff while my car was burning and pulled me out before it exploded. Her hands were burned. She had scars from that night for the rest of her life." In those desperate moments, Margaret and May made a choice. If Margaret was believed dead, Elaine would think she'd won. Margaret could escape, and May could preserve the evidence while waiting for the right moment to use it. May smuggled Margaret across the border into Canada, helped her establish a new identity, and took possession of the Rhapsody 12 dress that Margaret had worn at her final public appearance. "Leaving Gerald was the hardest thing I've ever done," Margaret whispered. "He was 16 years old, but May convinced me that if Elaine thought I was alive, she'd hurt him to get to me. If I stayed dead, he might be safe. We were wrong about that. Elaine found other ways to control him, but I couldn't risk coming forward while she had power." I arranged for Margaret to visit Gerald the next day at his home where he was still recovering. I didn't tell him who was coming, only that there was someone he needed to meet. When Margaret walked into his living room, leaning on her cane, Gerald stood from his chair and went completely still. He stared at her face, recognition dawning slowly, disbelief and hope warring in his expression. "Mom," he whispered the word barely audible. Margaret opened her arms and Gerald crossed the room in 3 unsteady steps, collapsing into her embrace like a child seeking comfort after a nightmare. He sobbed against her shoulder, 54 years of grief pouring out, while Margaret held him and murmured the things mothers say to wounded children. "I'm here. I'm so sorry. You're safe now. I'm here." I stood by the window with tears streaming down my face, watching my father, a 70-year-old man who'd lived most of his life believing his mother was dead, being held by the woman who'd sacrificed everything to protect him. Margaret was crying too, stroking Gerald's hair, telling him over and over that she was sorry that she'd wanted to come back, that May had convinced her staying dead was the only way to keep him safe from Elaine. When they finally separated, still holding hands, Margaret looked at both of us and said quietly, "May left something for you both. Something she was working on the night she died. She called it Rhapsody 13. A week after Margaret's revelation, May's estate attorney contacted me to say there was one final item from the estate that hadn't been distributed. He arrived at my apartment carrying a large white box wrapped in purple fabric, May's favorite color. Inside, carefully folded in tissue paper, was a wedding dress unlike anything I'd ever seen. It was exquisitely constructed, the bodice shaped and the skirt flowing, but it was clearly unfinished. The hem hung loose with temporary stitching, the sleeves were missing their lace overlay, and the pearl buttons down the back were only basted in place. Beneath the dress was a letter in May's handwriting dated just days before her death. "My darling Natalie, This is Rhapsody 13, commissioned by Margaret in 1970 for a daughter's future wedding. But Margaret had a son instead, and this dress waited. I've kept it unfinished for 54 years, waiting for the right bride. This dress is for you and Vanessa to complete together. Each stitch you add represents the truth you fought for, the family you protected, the love you chose over fear. When it's finished, give it to someone who needs to know that courage is inherited not in blood, but in action. I called Vanessa immediately, and when she saw the dress, she understood what May had intended. We organized a public stitching ceremony at the Brookfield Library, inviting everyone who'd been part of our journey. Over 3 evenings in late autumn, the library's community room filled with women bringing needles, thread, and stories. Margaret came, her hands still skilled despite her age, teaching younger women the techniques May had taught her decades ago. Ruth attended stitching carefully while sharing tales of her years investigating crimes no one else wanted to solve. The 43 women who'd testified against Elaine took turns adding their own contributions, each stitch a declaration that they would no longer be silent. Vanessa and I worked side by side, completing the hem together, our hands moving in rhythm as we talked about our mother, about May, about the family we were choosing to build from the wreckage of secrets and lies. A grandmother named Helen added delicate embroidery to the sleeves, telling us about finally leaving her abusive husband after 40 years. A young woman named Lisa carefully attached the pearl buttons, sharing how she'd reported workplace harassment despite threats to her career. Each woman who touched the dress added not just thread but testimony, creating a fabric archive of courage that would outlast all of us. When Rhapsody 13 was completed 3 weeks later, Dr. Whitmore arranged for it to be displayed beside Rhapsody 12 at the museum. The 2 dresses stood together under soft lighting, one bearing the wine stain of truth, activated, one glowing with the collective work of community healing. The dedication ceremony drew hundreds of people, and I stood at the podium reading from May's final letter. I learned as a young seamstress that every stitch holds tension. Pull too tight and the fabric puckers too loose and it falls apart. Justice is the same. We must hold truth firmly, but with enough flexibility to allow healing. We must stitch together the torn places in our families, our communities, our world, one careful thread at a time. My voice broke as I continued. My aunt taught me that what we inherit isn't wealth or status, but the courage to speak and the grace to listen. She taught me that family is built not just through blood, but through the conscious choice to protect and believe each other. And she taught me that truth, once stitched into fabric, becomes permanent, something that can be worn, displayed, passed down, and remembered. Dr. Whitmore announced that Rhapsody 13 would travel to museums across the country, with stitching ceremonies held in each city, creating an ever-growing archive of women's testimonies about speaking truth to power. As the ceremony concluded and guests began to leave, a well-dressed man approached Dr. Whitmore, speaking quietly but persistently. She glanced at me with raised eyebrows, and I walked over to hear him offering a blank check to purchase Rhapsody 13 for a private collection, insisting that such a significant piece belonged in the hands of a serious collector who could properly preserve it. I smiled and shook my head. Feeling May's presence so strongly, I almost turned to look for her. Tell him that some truths aren't for sale. They're for everyone. My aunt taught me that what we inherit isn't wealth or status, but the courage to speak and the grace to listen. And that legacy belongs to the world, not locked away in someone's private gallery. The man argued for another moment before Dr. Whitmore firmly escorted him toward the exit. I turned to find Vanessa, Gerald, and Margaret waiting for me near the museum doors. My sister reached for my hand. My father put his arm around my shoulders, and Margaret smiled at all of us with tears in her eyes. Together, we walked out into the November evening. The sky streaked with orange and purple, the air carrying the first hint of winter. We were a family stitched together not by blood alone, but by truth, forgiveness, and love, exactly the legacy May had spent her life creating, one careful stitch at a time. 6 months have passed since that November evening when we walked out of the museum together, and I'm sitting now in May's old seamstress shop, which we've transformed into the headquarters for the May Gordon Memorial Foundation. The sewing machines still hum, but now they're operated by women learning new skills, rebuilding their lives after escaping situations where someone else held all the power. Vanessa runs a weekly support group here for people recovering from financial abuse and manipulation. Gerald comes every Tuesday to teach a class on recognizing coercive relationships. Margaret, at 88, volunteers 3 days a week sharing stories and teaching the younger women the same stitching techniques May taught her 60 years ago. The Rhapsody dresses have traveled to 7 cities so far, and each stitching ceremony adds dozens of new testimonies to the archive. Women who thought they were alone in their experiences of being silenced or threatened or made to feel crazy discover they're part of a vast, connected web of survival and resistance. The dress that was supposed to be destroyed has become a monument to the impossibility of burying truth forever. Ruth tells me that 3 other cold cases involving charity fraud have been reopened because of the attention our story brought to how these crimes are committed and concealed. Elaine's conviction sent a message that even decades-old crimes, even crimes committed by powerful people with connections and money, can still face justice if the evidence is preserved and if someone is brave enough to stand in the light with it. Daniel and I celebrated our first anniversary last month, and I wore a simple dress that Vanessa made for me, each stitch sewn with love instead of secrets. We've learned what my mother knew, and what May spent her life proving, that family isn't defined by biology or tradition or the stories we inherit, but by the deliberate choice to protect, believe, and stand with each other even when it costs us everything we thought we wanted. Gerald is teaching me about the Whitman family history, the parts that weren't twisted by Elaine's manipulations, and I'm teaching him about the Gordon family strength that came from my mother's quiet determination to survive. We're writing a new story together, one where the truth doesn't hide in dress hems and locked filing cabinets, but lives openly in the way we treat each other. Sometimes I think about what May sacrificed, her safety, her final years of peace, ultimately her life, to make sure this story could be told. I think about my mother carrying guilt for crimes she never committed, dying without knowing she'd been framed by someone who saw her only as an obstacle. I think about Margaret spending 54 years believing her son thought she'd abandoned him. I think about all the years of silence and separation and unnecessary pain, and I feel the weight of what Elaine stole from us. But then I look around this shop at the women learning to trust themselves again, at Vanessa laughing with someone who understands what it means to be manipulated, at Gerald and Margaret sitting together mending the decades they lost, and I understand what May was trying to teach me all along. Justice isn't just about punishing the guilty. It's about creating space for healing, for truth-telling, for the slow, careful work of stitching together what's been torn apart. So I want to ask you something, everyone who's listened to this story. Have you been carrying secrets you were told to keep? Have you been protecting someone who hurt you because you were afraid of what they'd do if you spoke? Have you been made to feel guilty for crimes you didn't commit, or crazy for suspecting things that turned out to be true? You're not alone. Your story matters. Your truth deserves to be heard and believed. And there are people, maybe more than you know, who are ready to stand with you when you're ready to stand in the light. If this story resonated with you, if May's courage, or my mother's sacrifice, or even my stumbling journey toward truth meant something, I'd love for you to subscribe to this channel and share your thoughts in the comments below. Tell me what spoke to you. Tell me about the women in your life who protected truth when it was dangerous. Tell me about the moments you chose courage over comfort, or the times you wish you had. Let's create our own stitching circle here, a community of people who believe that some truths are too important to stay buried no matter how many years have passed, or how powerful the people who want them hidden. Every comment, every share, every subscription tells me that May's sacrifice meant something beyond our family, beyond our town, beyond the specific crimes we exposed. It tells me that her legacy of courage is being passed forward, one story at a time, one truth at a time, one careful stitch at a time. Thank you for listening. Thank you for believing. And thank you for being part of this community of truth tellers and justice seekers. May would have loved knowing her story reached you.